of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and I'm here today with Andrew McWhinney.
Yeah, McWhinney. Yeah, you got it.
All right, a editor and producer and a couple other things, definitely writer over at Negation Magazine. And I find Negation Magazine kind of interesting because not just your work, but a lot of work there seems to be kind of high communist theory, but aimed at turning it to some practical use as opposed to just pure high communist theory itself.
Totally.
And about in March of 2021, so a little over a year ago, you wrote a longish piece about post-left anarchism, and we'll come back to that because post-left is a word that I'm 41 years old. It has been used many different times at many different junctures on the left. And right now it kind of has two opposed meanings. So there's a group of people, mostly on Twitter, who are basically burnout social democrats who think that the Marxist left has been too copacetic to the bourgeois. But that's not who you're really talking about. They occasionally will use Baudrillard, but they sort of keep him on the back burner. You're talking about a kind of TikTok culture that's actually descended of a group of Marxists, a lot of whom, former Marxists, and who became anarchists, who then became primitivists and post-left anarchists in the 90s, that went away and then somehow reemerged on TikTok.
In a weird way, yeah. How I kind of came across this is like, I think this kind of, I think also speaks to sort of just like the way that these terms change, how these things come out in and out, especially like accelerating much more quickly, like how those changes happen. This is a very kind of conjunctural thing that I noticed at like a moment where I was just like on TikTok, as one does. And I just like came across like a bunch of weird like theory TikTokers and people were getting super into Baudrillard. There was like one person, I can't remember what their handle was, but they were just posting these like giant walls of text about like the failures of like, Marxist analysis, that, Baudrillard says all of these things about like simulation hyper reality, and we need to go beyond this, or like otherwise we're kind of trapped. Like to me, there just seemed to kind of be this sort of like obsession with the sort of like, I think a lot of the introduction people get to Baudrillard, like the simulation hyper reality. So it was something that came to me, and I was like, I had just started reading Baudrillard like a year about previously, and I had started reading with a lot of his early stuff, System of Objects, for a critique of the political economy of the sign, consumer society, where I was like, there's a lot of really good stuff here that is still helpful for, something that you would consider like a more historical materials analysis, but doesn't devolve into this sort of like, what you would maybe kind of say like just nihilism, I guess. So that's sort of where that came out of. I can't really say, and I don't really think that sort of like movement of people is around anymore, but it was just something that really sparked kind of like that initial drive for me to kind of write about that stuff and come to the defense of Baudrillard in a way that I thought was, helpful. So, yeah.
Yeah, I've done several things on Baudrillard. I've even like gone on to speak on another podcast about his particular turn, and his turn is interesting and I think informative. Most people know him from his late 80s, early 90s appearances and interventions in the pop culture, his influence on the Matrix, if you were in literary grad school in the aughts, you had to read Simulation and Simulacrum. It was absolutely required. But what people didn't read, and I think a lot of people don't read, is his early work where he started communist, and then this transitionary work, where he's burning out of communism, because specifically how the French Communist Party is positing itself in relationship to the Mitterrand government. And so a lot of post-leftist and burnt out, theorists and a lot of grad school students, frankly, get this weird appearance of him where like, okay, he's got some interesting works post-1968 that are Marxist-ish. They're a little different than most contemporary Marxists, but they're Marxist-ish. Then he becomes this hyper post-structuralist, post-modernist who doesn't believe in anything, and like now we're not here so much to talk about that weird turn, but I do think it's actually interesting that turn does not come out of nowhere. It's not even really I don't even think it's totally personal. But Baudrillard, I used to argue that like when I first encountered him, I was becoming a Marxist myself in my mid to late 20s.
Right.
I kind of thought he was a traitor.
Okay. Yeah. I can see that. Yeah.
And maybe a crypto reactionary. And then I like read all this work that in the Shadow of Silent Majorities, The Divine Left, these little books he's writing in response to the Communist Party and the Mitterrand government between like 1978 and 1986. And I'm like, oh, okay, this didn't come out of nowhere. This was actually a very specific sort of black pilling, to use modern terminology, that came out of what the left did in France.
Totally.
Kind of post 1968. Now, what I find interesting though, is you do put him in dialogue with the Situationists and a lot of, let's say, left communists and anarchist adjacent communists that kind of came out of the student movement in France in the 60s. And what I find interesting is you point out, I there's a meme of me where I talk about Guy Debord, where it has me quoting something I said about Guy Debord many years ago, where I said the spectacle is one of the most under theorized elements of like communist theory, and we kind of over rely on it.
Right.
And there is some theory in society of spectacle that kind of backs it up, but it's a little bit incomplete. And when people try to read Debord onto like modern meme theory or whatever, they're having to actually twist some meanings because they're changing the relationship of like symbol signifying spectacular events. That it's more based on like 1950s mass broadcast, mass television. But what I find interesting in your piece here is you argue that early Baudrillard actually probably does give you something like a useful theory of a political economy around symbolic representation, memes, mass spectacular imagery, branding, that frankly Marxists have kind of left since the 60s to anarchists or liberals or bourgeois sociologists. So what did you find so interesting about Baudrillard's early work on signification and its relationship to the political economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing that struck me is my first, like, in a weird way, introduction to like the concept of sign value, which is the big thing that I'm pulling from Baudrillard in this article. Is that I had watched this video on, you may have seen or heard of it. There was a guy, I don't remember, it's Jonas Chekas. He used to be called Cut Philosophy, right? He did a video on Baudrillard and American Psycho. And I was like, okay, I'm curious. I'm like learning things. It's a good way to kind of like absorb some theory. And that was the first time I heard about just the idea that you could be thinking about the commodity form itself and the forms of value the commodity has, but then also try and introduce into it semiotics. So you have, alongside the commodity form, use value, exchange value, you also have sign value. At the same time, I was kind of coming across that. I I was writing an undergrad thesis, I think, and my advisor got me super into like Pierre Bourdieu, one of those bourgeois sociologists you mentioned who kind of like does that sort of work on, signification, cultural, the link between like economic and cultural exploitation, domination. And I just thought the more that I kind of read Baudrillard and got into it, the more it was a more helpful and refined way of thinking about the relationship or like the actual form that, signification takes in capitalist society. So you're actually locating signification, not in just this kind of like, vague, kind of big spectacle that sits above or just kind of like emanates from like whatever you would call like the base. You have like signs operating like in the commodity form itself. So you can sort of trace a circuit of production and exchange and circulation where you sort of see all of these values moving together. Like that was that big thing. When I read For a General Theory, which is kind of this very short, but like, and as Baudrillard kind of, I think, points out in that essay too, very kind of like skeletons, he's like, this isn't exactly going to be bared out. We don't have any like, concrete way of saying if this is true, but this is what I propose in terms of looking at it. You get to sort of be thinking about all these other circuits of like how the sign interacts with, economic exploitation, this sort of, working together of, cultural domination and economic exploitation. So I thought that was kind of the biggest thing that drew me to it. And I was like, I think that's a really helpful way to then also critique people like Pierre Bourdieu, who sort of has similar ideas in his ideas and, thinking about like cultural capital and stuff. But, it's a bit of an incoherent concept because of the way he formulates capital. He doesn't really get into the actual kind of like, the Marxist understanding of capital, kind of the accumulation, MCM prime, right? That unequal sort of like exchange exploitation in there. So that Baudrillard was kind of a really good way to sort of get into the middle and kind of be thinking about those questions and thinking about signs and sign commodities as like a form of or a site of class struggle. Yeah. So
yeah, I think one of the most useful things about Pierre Bourdieu, who's again a bourgeois sociologist that I have a mixed relationship, but an interesting one, is like he does get into things that Marxists often forgo, like habitats are the way in which the cultural norms of your class origins do play out throughout your life and throughout kinds of social capital games. But then I pretty much came to the conclusion that from what I can tell, and I've had Bourdieuians argue with me about this.
Right. Okay.
But I'm like, so does he have a cultural definition of what class is? Because like the symbolic violence in class, blah, 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 blah. But it seems like the class you're born into for Bourdieu, your class background's almost more important and your habitus is almost more important than your relationship to production at all.
Yeah, totally.
And that's not true for early Baudrillard. And I think that's interesting. And I think it's more... like, so I think about the other people who wrote about this, is that the Frankfurt School culture industry, Adorno stuff. And while that stuff is useful, some of it is related to material studies of say, cultural production, mass production of culture, etc. A lot of it, even methodologically, is like, it has conclusions of which is trying to find a methodology.
Yeah.
And so I think Baudrillard also is somewhere in between that, even though he doesn't come out of that tradition at all. I mean, you kind of see him as a post-Althusserian response to the particular kind of Khrushchev-influenced French Communist Party of the 50s and early 60s, right? That's kind of what you imply in here.
Pretty much, yeah. Like, I think he's very much reacting in a way, especially those other influences. Like, he's kind of following that same sort of line. I mean, his doctoral advisor was Henri Lefebvre, who got kicked out, right, of the French Communist Party in the 50s, right, and was trying to think through, I think, similar questions to what Baudrillard eventually does. But Baudrillard, again, he takes that in a very kind of different direction. But yeah, he's very much operating, right, and kind of going against this sort of very, like, I think most people would call it like a very, like, reified or like or sort of like dogmatic orthodoxy, or like some people at Negation Magazine, I think, would go so far as to say, one of my colleagues in kind of his analysis of May 68 kind of argues that the PCF was like a social democratic party, not truly like a communist party or anything in that realm, right? So that sort of like thinking, which is, I think, where once you understand that context, you can sort of I think sympathize more with what Baudrillard's critiques and readings of Marxism were, like his kind of sweeping attacks that he kind of comes with later, and some of his critiques. But I think because some of that context gets lost, it gets very easy to kind of see his sweeping critiques of Marxism as like a comprehensive reading of Marxism to core. People are like, oh, well, Marxism inherently is a theory, can't account for, it's too productivist. It can't account for like all these things because it relies too much on the language or the discourse of political economy. Even if it's critique, it still reinforces the existence of that code. And I mean, you can see that maybe in like the context of like a PCF, party, or that kind of like very narrow reading, like a productivist reading of Marx. But and as Douglas Kellner says, he has a really fantastic book that I think helped me a lot when I was writing this, called Jean Baudrillard, From Marxism to Postmodernism and Beyond. Like, there's lots of other ways, like even in the text of Marx, to sort of avoid those pitfalls, or kind of read Marx in ways that are not those narrow productivist kind of shitty readings, and frankly shitty readings of Marx. So
yeah, I mean, it's one of the Trotskyists often say this, and I think it's usually unfair, but it's actually, I think it is true in this time period in the 50s and 60s, that the difference between Marxist-Leninist parties and social democratic parties was primarily one of aesthetics, and particularly in Western Europe, like the Communist Party of France, to a lesser degree the Party Communist Italy. It's hard to tell the difference between the Marxist-Leninist and the Social Democrats. So that's not true in the developing world. Like, it's very,
of course,
this is limited. But it does seem very much true. Like, and unfortunately now when I think about it, like the party that does remind me of it is like the Communist Party of India, which, while it's got Stalin and Mao on the placard, its actual agenda is pretty much like, let's do developmentalist Norway, but in like certain provinces of India. I get why Baudrillard found that frustrating.
I don't disagree. Yeah, I mean, like I'd be in the same boat. But the problem, again, like I would understand that frustration, and I would maybe get to a point where I get black-pilled myself, and I'm starting to write about the domination of objects over subjects at some point in my life. But like, I also just think it's also Baudrillard, I guess, if that's kind of the context that you have, and that is like your own experience. I don't know. In general, he's not exactly the most generous. He can be at times, but I don't think he's not exactly always the most careful or generous reader of, some of his interlocutors. And you sort of also see that later in some of his critiques against, other kind of thinkers later on, whether they're kind of more veiled or out there. Like, I don't know. Forget Foucault isn't, I guess that's one like exception, or it's not terrible. And there's like some interesting like things in there that are quite valuable, I'd say, in terms of like thinking through kind of like a critique of Foucault, or like a self-reflexivity and like taking a step back, but I think in some ways Baudrillard wasn't, I mean, a lot of thinkers like this wasn't willing to turn that against himself. That sort of same kind of critical eye in the same way, or the same kind of generosity. So
yeah, you point out the big turning point. For me, the explanatory books are books he wrote in the late 70s, early 80s, that are not generally read by scholars. Like, you can get them from semiotics if you really want to, but like, they're not the key text. I definitely wasn't ever, no one cited them when I was in grad school. Let me put it that way.
Right.
But the merit production is the interesting one, because I do think that if you look at the kind of productivist, like official Soviet, quasi-humanistic, strong modes of production, Marxism coming out of, like, honestly, even the Soviet Union's address outside of itself at this time, it does seem hyper-developmentalist. It seems to mirror, and this is not something that was unique to Baudrillard. I mean, other ultra-leftists who still consider themselves Marxist even would have said similar things, that it mirrored bourgeois conceptions of production and development so much that you could hardly tell them apart. I think about all the in the United States, there's all the both Trotskyist and Marxist humanist state capitalist theories that emerge around this time. Like there's all kinds of things that develop in this time period. I even think someone like Paul Sweezy, who's talking about how monopoly capital has ended the contradiction of value, and thus we don't have to worry about that anymore. And stuff that in retrospect seemed optimistic at best. But that was, that's I think that is what Baudrillard is responding to. And part of what I tell people when they turn on, post-Marxist, some of the post-Marxists I do think are purely bad faith interlocutors, but some of them, and Baudrillard's one of them in his early period. I think particularly in the mid-70s, where like he thinks he's actually taking Marxist critique to the next level and just turning it back on itself and seeing that it doesn't really live up to its own capacity. And if you look at what he's critiquing and the kinds of Marxism that was readily available in France and in just the English speaking world, and the English, French, Spanish, and Italian speaking world in general,
Europe, all that kind of
Europe, the beginnings of Euro communism and all that, like you can definitely see why he would have thought that. And it doesn't, all of a sudden it doesn't seem like a huge betrayal. But then you're like, he's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, even in like the mirror production. Like,
I really do think that. Like, I think the problem is like it is just like such a totalizing critique, and it is also frustrating, I guess, for me too when I read that book, because when Baudrillard is citing Marx and he's going back to like the original text of Marx and he's trying to be careful and cite all these things, you can definitely like see it's like, okay, he's not totally making shit up. Like if you can see like some quotes that he'll pull, I'm like, okay, I can see that, but it's still that same situation where I'm like, I don't know, I can read the same texts by Marx and other people read the same text by Marx, and either different parts of that same text or in that same paragraph, and can come up with something totally different that doesn't sort of field or doesn't, I think fit into that same sort of like productivist or reductionist way of understanding Marxism. I think my biggest gripe maybe, and I guess I can't blame Baudrillard for this, but part of me kind of wants to, is that it just kind of contributes to a lot of like, I think, broader straw manning of Marx and Marxist theory that kind of happened in other discourses. And some people who are a little too ready to jump on certain kinds of post-structuralist or certain kind of critiques of Marxism as kind of like, outmoded or out-fashioned or unable to like conceptualize certain things. Whereas like there's been a lot of like, self-critical Marxist work, self-reflective Marxist work that has tried to, move beyond and answer a lot of these questions. So maybe it's just kind of my, like, I don't know, I just see people who would be self-described Baudrillardians. Like there's an entire like Facebook group of them, people kind of like posting their articles and sharing their sort of memes and talking about the theory. And they really, truly do believe that the critiques of the mirror of production haven't been answered by Marxists, which I just don't think if you read any Marxist scholarship in the past, like 40 years is true. That's just kind of for me. And it gets to the point where you sort of see the turn towards the sort of ejection, I guess, of the role of a mode of production, right? Mm-hmm. That's where you start to sort of see the shift towards kind of the code kind of takes that space of if there was a spot, like a space where the mode of production had some kind of connection to the code, there was some sort of idea of like not a division between the basic superstructure, but like conceptually, there's some interaction going on there. There's an actual, for Baudrillard, I think at that point in that text, you sort of see the beginning of like, okay, now the code sort of envelops and wraps around this whole thing. You have just an entire kind of monolith of the code. And I think that's the biggest thing that drives me nuts. And you sort of see that's where, for me, the kind of the bathwater gets thrown out and we start kind of running into a lot more issues, at least with me, in terms of like some of the value of like his critique sort of slips out the back door there.
Yeah. So. If people want to see it contemporaneously, because in some ways this discourse feels like it is rooted in 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
In other ways though, I'm like, Mackenzie Works, she actually holds a lot of these theories and like thinks that Marshall
Right.
McLuhan is more explanatory of the modern economy than anything of Marx. And
I
I remember trying not to laugh at her when I interviewed her many years ago for a print blog, and like when she said that, and I was like, "Do you really believe that?" Like,
unironically, like
do you really think that like this symbolic exchange stuff totally means that we don't at base work on a MCM like commodity and rents based economy?
Yeah, right.
Like, I mean, I know there's a lot obscuring that now, and I think Marxists have tried to. One critique that I have had of Marxists is Marxists like trying to pretend that sometimes we're still in like a 19th century economy, and we haven't abandoned the gold standard or whatever. Like,
yeah.
But so I'm in agreement with you there. But the reason why I bring up Mackenzie Work is that people think that, okay, yeah, but you guys just went to grad school, like this doesn't affect anything. And I'm like, no, this is actually kind of the standard academic theory in like literary academic leftism even now, which is why if you can kind of tell, for example, Deleuze and Guattari get employed this way, where like we read the MCM circuit totally metaphorically and this, that, and the other. Now, I will also admit that the Guattari was some kind of weird trot that no one completely understands.
I would make that argument too. Yeah.
Exact trajectory to Marxism, because he's writing in a very opaque way and maybe slightly crazy. But like it's funny because I'm always like, I like Guattari. I don't know about this Deleuze thing, but I feel like Guattari is somehow a Marxist. Because he says he is, and there's hints of it, but I can't tell you how. Like,
no, I feel the same way. It's just purely vibes. It's like you can tell that he's a Marxist, but like in a sort of very particular way. It's very funny. I totally agree with that.
So one concept you seem to want to redeem though, and kind of reinterject in the Marxist discourse, it's sign value. So let's talk about that a little bit. Why is sound value important, and how does it answer? You bring up that kind of is like the key to answering some of the stuff that comes out of the Society of Spectacle, which I think you and I both separately have come to the conclusion was, well, that's an interesting idea, and there's stuff in it that's useful, but the theoretical workings of it's just not there. It's not in DeBoer. So
totally. Yeah. I mean, I was kind of talking a little bit about this before, but I think the biggest thing is just like understanding, it's just making, I think, those clear structural links between the commodity form and the production of signs, that you can locate sign value in like a particular in the circulation of commodities under like whatever stage of capitalism we want to call this is, right? So if there's like an increasing kind of proliferation and circulation of images alongside kind of commodities, as well as, capitalist technological progress, we have this continued kind of like acceleration of like production of commodities and images and so on. We kind of begin to think about that sort of level of locating, critiquing where those are. Also ensuring like I think it's helpful as well in that you maybe have a better way of grasping, I think, the important critique. And tons of people talk this. Raymond Williams in particular kind of jumps to my mind as kind of like getting rid of the, clunky and frankly a bit, mechanistic understanding of like the base and superstructure in terms of thinking about like the relationship between ideology and the means or mode of production, those forces, right? So I think that's there. And I think another big thing too is also just understanding, at least for me, some of the things that can to some degree escape what you might call like kind of a rational kind of form of just like purely economic exchange. Like you have something that is also working and over determining some forms of commodity production that isn't purely reducible to like a quote unquote use value or exchange value. There's also some sort of like, questions of certain kinds of prestige. How is that being used, that kind of molding of certain kinds of discourses of kind of, cultural prestige and so on, to also contribute to kind of like class domination, right? On top of that. So I think it's really good for, thinking about those questions, getting into sort of like the inner kind of workings, or beginning to think about how those circuits work, right? Again, like this is one article that posits this is like, hey, this is a really good inroad to this. I really do think, alongside kind of what Baudrillard was saying, that there needs to be like a really, I think, much more critical investigation and more of a systemic kind of, building up of what those kind of circuits look like. But I don't know. To me, it makes a lot more sense than kind of just like, I don't know, saying that capitalism has just like completely changed, that we're no longer living under capitalism, that like we can't explain the sort of like, presence and like of like these more, sign-based or, this kind of like symbolic code that seems to be ever much more present than it used to be. Yeah, I think it's just helpful to be thinking about that. And also just like thinking about the sign and discourse signification as a side of like class struggle as well. I think I'm trying to think if there's anything else off the top of my head that kind of links to that. I'm beginning to run out of steam a bit. But those are sort of like the biggest things there. And yeah, I don't know. I just think it would be helpful to remember that we're not just stuck critiquing just like capitalist culture or just critiquing the capitalist mode of production, like on these two sides of the same coin. This is kind of a way we can do the important thing of looking at those two things together as like key to the reproduction of capitalism and also us kind of overthrowing, capitalism as a system. Like how do we orient our praxis to be kind of addressing both of those things at the same time?
Yeah, I think what's interesting to me is there's the attempts of that and understanding like cultural hegemony and Gramsci, which I ultimately don't find that persuasive, but I think there's hints of something there too. One thing that I have liked that kind of Hegelianized Marxist in the English tradition, say E.P. Thompson, Raymond Williams, have pointed out is not forgetting that relations of production and the entire symbolic edifice around that is actually part of the base, and kind of way the base superstructure metaphor doesn't entirely work. I think Ellen Ricken's Words actually points this out, that like, well, when you look at relations of production and talk about like how symbolic and legal relations are part of relations of production, which are part of the mode, saying that like all ideology is superstructural doesn't really hold up, because part of the culture reinforces the roles available to people in the way they organize not their production but their social reproduction, and that's key. And I think what Baudrillard in this kind of post-68 Marxism was trying to do in response to the advent of mass media and the advent of IPs and an entire system of rents that seemed to restore profitability in a way that made it look like for a while that maybe the old business cycle wasn't in application anymore. That while was very brief and actually very tied to a world war, but I know why they thought it. Like when you go back, and so I think now we have similar problems because like how much of our, when you look at like, we're in a time period of what seems like super profits, but how much of it's actually tied up in rents? How much of it's tied up in IPs? How much of it's tied up in images? And yet, if we look at the overall economy, that stuff only happens in highly materially commodity producing societies. Even if it doesn't employ a lot of people, like the United States is a highly productive industrial economy that also doesn't employ hardly anyone in that production. It's like something between like 9 and 13% of people in that. So I think that's interesting because we do have to explain like, why are there so many people involved in modern advanced capitalism in what is effectively image production, concept maintenance, brand maintenance, IP capture, rents, weird shit like Bitcoin, which has no productivity whatsoever. Like, why is so much of our current employment activity, etc., tied up in that? I think I don't think there's a clear answer right now, but I do think you do have to look at these theorists that emerge in this time period. Another one's Andre Gortz, the Euro-communist. Now, a lot of them completely give up on Marx, like just completely. And that's the thing that happens, not just with the famous ones, because Gortz is not one of these people that you read in grad school. But And so I think what's interesting is Jameson pushes back on that, and then and really in the late 90s, early aughts, but doesn't really, honestly, because of the nature of just his discipline, have like that strong of a material explanation as to why. Just pointing out that, well, there's a subtle like rhetorical way Jameson actually is kind of turning Baudrillard on his head, where he's like, well, if you're saying that Marxism reproduces bourgeois logic, well, you guys are just reproducing the logic of late capitalism, Lyotard and Baudrillard and all you Frenchies.
Yeah. There you go.
Right.
Yeah. Finger wagging. Yeah.
So I found this section though where you go and you say, well, we can use this concept of sign. It's useful, particularly if we look at this for general theory stuff, this very early Baudrillard work.
Mm-hmm.
But you also point out in your sign fetishism part of the essay that some of the things are going to be a bomb later after the mirror production that really come out, I think we could kind of psychologically explain and Baudrillard's frustration with the Communist Party of France and the Mitterrand government, but theoretically are already in this early work. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the biggest thing that jumps out to me is, again, this sort of emphasis on it's the sign fetishism, the kind of the code, the sort of Douglas Kellner calls it like a semi-logical idealism, which I think is kind of a nice, fun little way to put it. It's a nice little dig. Sometimes I think I can smile and kind of dig at Baudrillard for that. The biggest thing for me is that I think Baudrillard is, when it comes to like the science system and discourses, is very like functionalist. And I think that's like a big critique that people have even of that early work, because it comes across as kind of very functional. There isn't really a lot of room for, people to resist these systems or use them and break them, which is weird because I think there's a bit of a tension in it, because there's stuff where he's talking about earlier in For a Critique of the Political Economy of the Sign, where he's talking about how individuals, when they're kind of working through, they're consuming sign commodities, they're organizing them and arranging them in certain ways. Like, we're coming back to that kind of system of object stuff. And they're trying to do it in order to like stand out or, move around sort of these standards of like social standing, right? We have a personal trajectory we want to enter. We're going to kind of jostle our position. It's very much a capitalist even too. You could draw the kind of connections with Bourdieu, right? But at the same time, Baudrillard has this kind of thing where a lot of, if there are going to be, or how do I say, he kind of, has these little moments where there seems to be moments of resistance in this kind of, sign, kind of sign arrangement consumption. For the most part, the code kind of just has, these are the spots. It is going to put you there. There's nothing you can really do. Also, use value isn't a real thing. It's completely made up. It is purely there just to like be a guarantor for like exchange value, which is just dumb. I just really think that's just a bad reading of Marx. And like I mentioned in the essay, read Capital Volume 1. Marx doesn't make use value this purely like, biological ahistorical thing. There's like all kinds of different needs. They change over time and so on. So there's kind of issues there. Baudrillard's always very like vague when it comes to talking about what the code is. And he's like this through all of his stuff. Even later when he still is talking about the code and like symbolic exchange and death, he still links the code to capital, but it's not really clear what capital is beyond purely its like self-referentiality and reproduction. Like it's to me, and I think I say this again in the essay too, it's like the appearance of like, this is what the end game would be if capitalism had its way. This is like all coming from the perspective of capital. If it managed to actually extinguish any sort of conflict, any sort of like, contradiction in the system. And I think that is kind of like the biggest thing that you sort of see in a lot of his early work, and that clearly carries through. And I think that's part of where you sort of see the black pilling and so on, or kind of the jettisoning of kind of like, dialectics or any of this kind of stuff about contradiction. Because I think as it appears to him, or at least the way he's theorizing things, there's just the one way that it's going to be. Slowly it's kind of progressing, people are getting, more and more, media gets colder and colder, discourses get colder and colder, things become flatter and flatter, things implode. And that's pretty much it, right? So that's kind of the biggest thing that seems to be bothers me the most, right? So the limited responses that you can have kind of result in Baudrillard kind of looking first for, something completely outside of the system, symbolic exchange, right? So not participating in this sort of logic of like equivalence of exchange, but of, complete, excess, right? Waste, kind of drawing on like Bataille and Marcel Mauss and the kind of this idea of kind of like a radical gift. Like we're trying to accelerate this process so far that it kind of explodes itself. But then that doesn't even begin to kind of work for him after a certain point. It just becomes like a foregone conclusion. You have to begin taking on kind of the position of the object. The object has won now. So the best thing that we can do to survive in this kind of like dystopian nightmare is to sort of like emulate what it's like to be an object and kind of join that side in a weird way. It gets real fucking weird by like fatal strategies. But so for me, it feels like he's already kind of at the foregone conclusion of what capitalism kind of wants. And through that, we don't have a lot of room to think about, actually stopping this,
Right.
So.
I mean, I think about that. I mean, you see that tendency in a lot of post 40s, well, the working class didn't do what we thought it was going to do. And right before World War II. So, capitalism won, it's good forever. People don't realize that when they read Adorno, and that's not true for all the Frankfurt School, but there's very much a strain even in that thought. If you read like Dialectic of Enlightenment, where like the bad guys won because the working class has totally capitulated capitalist logic. They are no longer an external force, and also there's no real commodity form, like marginalists may be right somehow because of monopoly capital. Therefore, we pretty much lost. Have a nice day. Bye. It really does get to the Hotel Grand Abyss stuff where it's like, and I think it's interesting because there's a lot of this in post-Marxist French discourse. It's not just Baudrillard. I mean, you see the weird places where Foucault goes in the late 70s, early 80s, where he's like, well, maybe radical Shiite Islamism is a way out. Maybe neoliberalism a la Hayek is a way out. Fuck it, I don't know. Like
we need something, for fuck's sakes, give us something that'll work,
maybe Diogenean parrhesia a la the 4th century Cynics is the way. I'm like, you're really reaching for it, bro. And then you see and by the 90s, I think this becomes, there is a discourse where it feels like the bad guys won. We've now come up with an elaborate theory for why. It's mostly about symbolic exchange. Capital or the system or whatever is both everywhere and nowhere. It's an all-present power relation, which we cannot get out of, even in our rebellions.
Yeah.
And here's an ideological edifice to build that on. And also, the Soviet Union fell, and so we're all super black pilled now. And Gen Xers are forever going to be reactionaries, they say, as a borderline Gen Xer. But I mean, I think it's interesting because I like to go, like, the materialist in me goes, let's swoon out and look like why they would have thought this, though.
Yeah, right.
Like because it really did seem pretty bad. Like, the Soviet Union's falling apart, and it's obvious to people it's falling apart as early as the late 70s.
Yeah.
All these people in France, in particular, Mao in France often played the same role as Trotsky in the United States as like the communism that you could project upon, because in France it was they just didn't know what was going on in China all the time.
Right.
With Trotsky's, he never got a chance, so we could just kind of project. And not really look at what Trotsky actually advocated when he was in the USSR. But regardless, that and when 1978 happens, and there's the Gang of Four Dung
right
stuff, they lose faith in that. Even people like Norm Finkelstein writes about this, where he was like, well, what are you supposed to do after that? So there was other responses in the West, in Latin America, and in the United States with like Marxist Leninism, Maoism, and stuff. But if you're being intellectually honest, a lot of that stuff actually doesn't happen till the mid to late 80s in response to this period. And And I think it's interesting to look back at it because I think, practically speaking, by the way, I think we might see a similar turn since a lot of people really invested in this Popular Front strategy with Bernie and like quasi party building, a party within a party, and that has, to put it mildly, seemingly not worked out all that well.
I can't say. People still want to try, man. The Bernie 2024, baby. Let's go. Let's get him out there. Let's do it again. Third time's the charm,
Yeah,
At some point, you gotta just let go, dude, for fuck's sakes. Anyways, sorry. Continue. But
well, I think that's interesting. I want to turn this a little bit. I'll spend a little bit less time, but on your totality in the Vanguard function thing, because I saw that you were mentioning a book that I love, Rodrigo Nunes, Neither Vertical nor Horizontal, which is like, hey, party Marxist and councilist left communist and anarchist and like community organizers, you're all wrong and you're all right kind of simultaneously. So let's have a serious conversation about how to fix this. You quote Jody Dean Crowds and Party, which I think Jody Dean and I have a personal disagreements, but I actually think that book and her book Conrad's are actually good.
Yeah, they're decent.
They're pretty good. And you quote my historical Brett Knorr, Lukács.
Yes, my man.
which people who follow me and know the idiosyncrasies of Varnland know that like I have a love-hate relationship with Lukács. It's deep. But you bring up Nunes and trying to reconceptualize this is interesting because one thing I would like to point out to people, this entire party building experiment that we tried last time wasn't actually a party building experiment. It was like kind of an attempt to build a faction within a bourgeois party that would either incept it or break it apart and then build a labor party to then build a communist. It was like
right.
There's like 4 steps removed from party building, and for reasons that make some sense, because most of the communist strategic manuals, be they from Lenin to Kautsky to whatever, actually assumed a parliamentary system. Yeah. So like when you talk about like Popular Front versus United Front from below versus traditional United Front versus Trotsky United Front, which people's like, oh, I know even most of the communists who listen to me, when I start talking about that, their eyes just glaze over. Like they're just like, what are those weird? Those are such minor differences. And sometimes they're minor, sometimes they're actually far more profound than it seems, but none of them were designed for a first past the post non-parliamentary representative system. They didn't assume that. So Nunes, I think, is interesting because he does kind of give you a way to think about it that can get you somewhat of a way out where you're not like, we either have to do party building or we have to do movement building or we have to do base building or dual power organization or whatever. What he kind of gives you a way of like, okay, you kind of have to do that all at the same time because they all already exist.
Yeah,
right.
Totally.
So, what did you find useful? I mean, because you are both critiquing this focus on the party form, but also like not poo-pooing it, say like ultra left communists have traditionally done or council communists have traditionally done.
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing is I was just trying to find a way to say, okay, it's that same kind of just like I saw a lot of, it was just in grad school. I did I was in literary studies. I was in English grad school. I did my MA, and I just saw a lot of stuff.
I'm an MFA, so
there you go.
I'm like, we have mutually informed class trauma.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, exactly. Right. So the same kind of shit that we fucking read about like radical organizing and these things. It's like, fuck, this just sucks. There's just a lot of like praise and kind of like, oh, it's just so great that there was all these horizontalist like movements. Isn't horizontalism so good that it evolves all these problems? And I'm just like, literally, it's like, oh, wasn't Occupy so cool? I'm like,
yeah, it literally couldn't do anything.
It literally couldn't do shit. So but I also wanted to be like, okay, I don't want to be the annoying fucking person who is just like, the only thing that we can do is build the Bolshevik party form. That is the only viable mode of organization. And we must use it to kind of like, we must swallow everybody sort of into it in order to do like, it is the only thing that can achieve kind of the goals that we want. So I kind of wanted to think of a way of saying, okay, how have people traditionally thought about the party? And that's where I turned to kind of Lukács and kind of Lukács's writings in History and Class Consciousness, the role of the party, and kind of his kind of weaving through of the Leninist and the Luxembourgists like Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin's kind of arguments about the party. And I was just trying to say, okay, so if the goal roughly, and I'll be kind of, simplifying my argument here, if the goal of communist organizing, at least with the party, is to build class consciousness, and class consciousness isn't just kind of like, I'm aware of my class, but it's also the ability to like act on that and enact material differences in the world that would bring you further to kind of like the abolition of capitalism, right? Is the party form the only thing that can do that? There are clearly things that the party can do in certain kinds of conjunctures and it has certain kinds of traits that allow it to do that, but is it and should it exclusively be the only thing, right? That's why I contrast Lukács with like Guy Debord. Welcome back, Guy. He's back now. To kind of think about this is the other way. We can still think of the same kind of questions of like totality, thinking through class consciousness, but Guy Debord's like, fuck Lukács. Like Lukács was totally wrong. He was super into the Bolsheviks, and that was his like, he was like a reformist fucking Stalinist, right. So Nunes was a good way of saying, okay, we can kind of think about the vanguard function, which is like the word that Rodrigo Nunes uses. So instead of thinking about like a vanguard party being the only thing that can fulfill, the organization and building of like class force against, the bourgeoisie, whatever you want to call ruling class, whatever terminology you want to use, we can be thinking about different forms of organizing, whether that be the traditionalist kind of more vertically party, whether it's something that's much more mass and quote unquote spontaneous. Nunes has great critique of spontaneity. If people think that spontaneous organizing is still a thing, you should read Nunes. And there's a lot of people who've written on that, but Nunes has a very particularly, I should say, good critique of that. But trying to think about, especially in a world today where communist parties are super fucking weak, there's certain kinds of ways of, culturally, and this kind of comes back to the question.
Hell, even labor parties. Like, we talk about how, the U.S. doesn't have a historical labor party, but like France and Germany, and I'm like, yeah, but they're like at this point, the effective difference between the SPD and like the Democrats is like nothing.
Yeah, pretty much, right? Yeah.
So
it's the same thing in Canada. Like, it's like, and people are like, oh, the NDP is like the working class party, and like the NDP hasn't been close to like anything to like close to like being in line with like quote unquote working class interests for decades now. And like, it's been
they had a little experiment with it kinda in Alberta, which then immediately failed.
Pretty much, yeah. So here we are. And so kind of what Nunes is great for is being able to say, okay, so if our goal is to build class consciousness in this very particular way, which is essential because of, the way that in kind of like late capitalism and in like an era of a cultural postmodernity, it's very hard to even imagine ways of organizing and struggling to change our circumstances. Hence why that's my emphasis kind of on the role of totality. I bring in Jameson and all of that. It's fun. I love my man Jameson. But yeah, Nunes was just great for being like, all right, we can say right now that we are focusing way too much on these kind of horizontal forms of organizing. We can't get past sort of these traumas that came with sort of the failures of, more Marxist-Leninist or Bolshevik parties. We need to find ways of working through that and kind of being realistic and coming together and say, okay, how do we look at this not as what form is the right one, but what form do we need? What forms do we need to get to where we need to be?
I liked your stuff about pluralistic verticalism and I like Nunes as neither vertical nor horizontal, because you do have to do, like, I talk about like cybernetic information structures that you can use, input things, the things that actually remove the need for the energy spent on bureaucratization and complexity.
Yeah.
That destroyed parties. I mean, it was a real problem for like the SPD in the 19-teens. The thing I like about this though is we're not saying like, we're not saying let's go back to horizontalism from either the anarchist or the left communist perspective.
Yeah.
but we're also not saying, because I think a lot of people, particularly as Occupy failed, then let's try dirty break democratic socialism within, boring from within in the Democratic Party with a mixture of like Ackerman and Harrington and which, by the way, is some of the most milk toast. But anyway, and I was like, at the time, I'm like, so we're gonna build a popular front, but like we're not mass, and we don't have a mass thing to build upon, and we don't have a way to hold our people accountable, and we don't have a program, and we don't have we actually don't also have a horizontalist way to build a vertical program, which I think is something Nunes is good on.
Totally.
Like the program does emerge from the people involved in your politics. Like you can't just like impose it from on high.
Totally.
That I think that Nunes book does give us a way to think around. I think it's interesting because that Nunes book is one of the only books I can talk to left communist, normal communist, whatever that means. And anarchist, and we all find use in that book.
Totally.
Whereas everything else is like, let's fight about shit that we argued about 200 years ago.
Yeah.
Like
totally. Like, and
debate of the First International.
Like, I don't know. It's funny because like I read something like we were talking. If we come back to Crowds and Party, I had read Crowds and Party and was planning on drawing on it, but I had a lot of there's some of the things that Jody Dean talked, at least in terms of like current conjunctural politics, I think was interesting and helpful in terms of thinking about, things like crowds and masses. How do we think about how the party works to like channel certain kinds of like modes of desire, that kind of psychoanalytic register that's going on. I still had a lot of issues with her sort of just like fetishism of the party. So it was like, this is the one thing that allows us to sort of do all the stuff that we need to do. This has to be like I don't know. I'm like, if I gave it to somebody else to try and explain why, like, I don't think they would find that, or explain why this is what we like need. I don't think they would find that super compelling. I think the initial question would just be like, so can't there literally be like several things that do these functions? Like, why does it have to be the party? I don't know. It helps, I think, us not kind of sit in sort of squabbles of like, instead of like stick bending one way or the other over and over again into oblivion, we just fucking spiral down the drain as we keep trying to turn a ship like one way or another.
Yeah, let's debate Kronstadt one more time. Let's debate what Luxembourg really meant in her criticisms and endorsement of the bullshit. I mean, Luxembourg's a fascinating person because when you read Luxembourg, like everybody but social Democrats can claim her. In her critiques of the Bolsheviks, she's also like, but we got to do this, and they are a revolutionary force, and like, this, that, and the other. But also, it's the structure of this. And what I found interesting is I do think there are other people who see the problem. I think even Leninists who've returned to a Kauskian understanding of this, like who will say we're Leninists, but we're against the faction ban. We kind of realize that you need independent working class institutions that are somewhat, even if they're coordinated by the party or independent from the party, which I mean historically was actually what even the Moscow inspired communist parties did. I mean, because like the CIO and the TUL were, you didn't have to be a communist party member to be in those organizations. Like, right. They were union organizations which were run by Communist Party members, but and the CIO wasn't run by Communist Party members. It was run by all kinds of people, including Communist Party members. And it was a source of working class power, although because of the focus on the party and because of the focus on the Popular Front, it was also liquidated in the 50s. So, like, I think these questions are interesting because, I think we have a psychologically predictable dynamic that's emerged since Actually, I'd even go so far back as since the alter globalization movement. So like,
Okay.
I am old enough that my first radical moment was also my first de-radical moment. I showed up to Seattle as an 18-year-old.
Okay.
Because I'm born in 1980. You can, I'll go ahead and admit my age. And I'm from the Southeast. It's my first time in the West Coast. I see all kinds of people, from Pat Buchanan to black anarchists battling the G8. They get some concessions. They declare victory. But I feel like I have this nagging feeling, even as an 18-year-old, that like, hey, why are we trying to dance in the street while we're doing this? I'm not against joy and dancing in the street.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the things I always point out to people, to highly sectarian communists who are like party discipline all the time, I'm like, even the Bolsheviks had social functions.
Yeah.
And the SPD had like their own sports league.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It wasn't all work, but it also wasn't work. I mean, it wasn't like not work when you're doing action. Like,
yeah.
But anyway, so I'm involved in that. That's totally horizontalist. It's really weird. It's so pluralist that they let Pat Buchanan in, which is replicated in Occupy with like, Alex Jones people showing up and at occupations. What I found interesting about Occupy, I was abroad when it happened, but I was involved. I was involved in Occupy Yoido, and then the nature of my job, they paid for me to go back to do a conference, and I stopped by and saw the breakup after Safkati Park and the kind of groups around that.
Right.
I definitely felt what was interesting in Occupy is it was a whole lot of people got the horizontalism fetish kind of knocked out of their skull a little bit. Because they couldn't, like, one, if we're really honest, Occupy grew because of popular discontent with the Democrats and the turn about class stuff during the end of the Great Recession, but also because the cops beat them up.
Yes.
That was the dividing line. And what I pointed out is like, yeah, but we don't control that. Like, if they quit beating us up, we lose the ability to grow off of them beating us up. And this is something that Hotel Abissi Adorno was right about, that kind of confrontation with the cops, a lot of times, instead of being able to turn it into some other positive form, you're addicted to trying to find the dynamism of that. Like, well, we fought the cops. Fucking yeah.
Right.
And this is not a critique of like semi-spontaneous movements. I think a lot of things that we say are spontaneous are not that spontaneous.
Yeah.
But semi-spontaneous movements, it can be a critique of not being able to build stuff after insurrections and protests, like the Floyd protest, and then being able to be really easily recuperated by liberal activists. And I think that's fair. But your article got me thinking, like, we have to have multiple ways to handle this. And it is just not true that even in the height of, say, the Vanguard Party Forum, Third International Comintern, that even the communists were only using the party form to fight their battles. It's not true. That was a fetish of the 60s and the sectarian movements, which, to me, like, if you read like Max Elbaum's Revolution in the Air or something like that about the social democratic and anti-revisionist left, and realize how many groups existed because they thought they were in parties that had the true line. Like, if the membership numbers are correct, then in 1971 there was something like 1 million people divided up over like 110 parties in the United States alone.
Jesus.
In the various communist movements after the SDS fell apart. And the SDS was only ever, I think the largest the SDS got was like 60,000. If you adjust for population size, it was probably bigger than the DSA, but that it was roughly equivalent to the high point of the DSA,
right?
Adjusted for population size, and in absolute numbers, it was smaller. And then it broke down into sectarian organizations, and sectarian organizations seem to have a cap in these like party forms of about 5,000, regardless of what they were. So if they were Trotskyists or the IWW or the RCP, are the remains of the SP of the SWP or whatever, like they all seem to cap out at about 5,000. In fact, that was true for most left organizations until the resurrection of the DSA. Like, and I have no idea why 5,000 was like a number that was a hard cap. Like, it just seems arbitrary, but it was what it was. Like, the Black Panthers were never even that big. Like, it was, you know, you're dealing with organizations of thousands of people, but they were broken up over tons of different organizations. And if there had been multiple ways to unify them, they might not have been totally dispersed in the neoliberal 80s.
Yeah, totally.
Instead, they were totally dispersed in their neoliberal 80s, and also the traditional business union movement kind of gets crushed. Like everything sort of falls apart.
Yeah.
And I personally don't find it compelling to basically tell people, well, we have to LARP 1917, and maybe through the end of the Comintern, the Third International Organization parties, even though objectively we know that the USSR is not still around, or we wouldn't even be talking about this the way we're talking about it. So it's like, that's always my response to hardcore Marxist Leninists when they're like, well, we have the proof that this works. I'm like, well, if I use your argument about the proof that works, what country doesn't exist anymore?
Yeah, totally, right. And they'll be like, well, there's like a party form operating somewhere else. And I'm like, okay, well, that's great. Is it really the exact same as like the Marxist-Leninist party? What's going on differently there? Like, and how many other divided parties are operating right in some of those areas where you might claim is like this is the evidence where the party form is working, right? The biggest thing for me is then I think what bothered me the most, especially when it comes to this sort of discussion, is that like people are kind of bitching about this is the right way to do it or this is the right way to do it when like you're right. Literally nobody has the upper like ground or has no proof to like that like anything works. We're all kind of in a position where right now everything that we've tried so far has failed, vertical or horizontal in terms of organizing forums. We have nobody has any sort of like moral or empirical sort of claim to be like this thing is like a perfect form. Like another big thing, I guess that was big too in kind of this article that I wanted to take seriously was like both forms of organizing, if you wanted to think on like the vertical horizontal spectrum, have like flaws or faults that are inherent to them and will come up unless you do the work of politics to try and be, self-reflexive about those things. Are you worried about kind of the ossification and the bureaucratization of your vertical party? And you're like, well, that's always going to happen, so I'm going to do something else that's not going to do that. You're just running away from a problem that you have to deal with in the process of politics. Same with like a horizontal thing. You're just like, this horizontal organization can't muster up a program or do something that helps build something positive after certain action. And I'm going to go do this thing that's purely, this, vertical thing. And that's going to be the thing that gives us, what we need versus this other shit. And it's like, it's kind of a purely kind of reactive way of thinking about where your organizing needs to go. So I really do think it's kind of like hey guys, let's recognize we're all kind of fucked here. Like we kind of are in a position conjuncturally where having distributed leadership, having different sort of like, and this is kind of newness as language, like nodes, right? Nodes of organizing, nodes of power, distributed in different ways, organized in certain kinds of just like, different kinds of organizational forms and so on. Like we need to do that, especially now when there just isn't really a lot of strong, and arguably there really isn't a ton of strong nodes, right? So yeah, like I just don't want people to be kind of like stuck up about what things right when like it's clearly we're in a position where we failed. And that doesn't mean to be black pill. That is something we have to kind of confront and just be honest with ourselves about in order to actually get about doing more effective organizing, and yeah, so that we're not just kind of like falling back into fetishism or like getting stuck on like certain kinds of traumas of one way of organizing over the other. So
yeah, I'm with you on that. I was like going over the Baudrillard piece, and then I was like, oh man, the specters of the party stuff is really interesting. So I want to talk about Negation Magazine a little bit, and then I'm gonna let you go. I always like to tell people, as a person who used to be a communist publisher, that's sort of how I got into this world.
For sure.
I'm that, and I'm a union organizer now.
Okay. Yeah.
But used to work with Zero Books, used to work with North Star, used to do my own media project that was totally independent. Am now doing my own media project that's totally independent. My big ask of people is always like, what the fuck do you think you're doing? Because like, this is funny, actually. This is a funny story. When I left a small microsec party in 2015 with another group, we formed a journal called the Emancipation Network. We had been giving up the journal. It became an independent podcast network, and then I later left it.
Okay.
But my comrade and sometimes friend, Donald Parkinson, was like, why on earth do we need another communist journal? And I think it's funny because then about a year and a half later, he would go on to found Cosmonaut, which is like prima facie, a really kind of successful another communist journal.
Yeah, respect. You know what? Look, all power to him, dude. All power to Donald, man. He did it. He pulled through. So.
Yeah, but I do ask this question because I've been involved, like, I can run through a litany of communist magazines that I've seen in the past decade that are not Cosmonaut. Some of them had a temporary mass appeal, like, people don't remember North Star magazine, except for we did one thing, and we published the infamous Vampire Castle essay by Ed Fisher. We're the people who did that.
Okay, there you go. Yeah,
that's what we did. Pretty much, we didn't succeed in anything after that, and weren't that important before that. But that's what we did. Like,
right.
And that essay has outlived that site. It's outlived the debates around it. It's outlived Mark.
Sadly. Rest in peace. Yeah.
So it's if people don't know Mark's work, they generally know that.
Yeah.
But I do think it's interesting because I'm also no longer of the opinion, like, I would not say to people now because there have been times when Donald and I basically flipped, and I've been like, why do we need another fucking communist magazine? There's already like 1,000. Like, we got Tempest, we got we got Cosmonaut, we got Sublation Magazine, we got Jacobin, Current Affairs. Well, I guess Current Affairs is whatever. We'll cut them off. We got every Trotskyist party's newspaper fetish. Like, we got weird shit like the World Socialist website that's run by particularly strange people. We got we had Kasama Project. We had and then we had Ultracom. Does anyone remember Ultracom, or is that just me? We had Ritual Magazine. Like, I can go through them, and like people will be like, I don't even know what a fifth of those are. But I do think, all right, this after that tirade, I like a project like Negation Magazine because, and I'm not saying that because you're on my show, because I just would have asked you to be on my show if I didn't like the magazine. I found you guys through reading another communist magazine, and I sometimes will admit the only reason I read communist magazines is to find guests, because a lot of times they make my eyes glaze over. But what I found interesting about Negation is that you were taking high communist theory and like humanities debates, but instead of like just leaving them as high communist theory and humanities debates, like you would on like a theoretical Facebook group or one of the 85,000 Deleuze and Guattari application groups, you are trying to take them and apply them to actual communist questions which not a lot of people are doing right now, despite this proliferation of communist publishing. Like, there are people, basically, you have that, something like, to think, like, you have theory intellectuals and history intellectuals, and most of the last 20 years have been theory intellectuals dominant. The last 10 years actually have been mostly history intellectuals dominant. You guys are trying to do a little bit of both. So can I ask, you're on the editorial team. I read your mission statement. What did Zoomers do to you?
Well, that's the thing. I am a Zoomer. What do we do to ourselves? More the question. Everybody who is a member of the editorial board of Negation is basically like, on most of us are kind of like right on the cap, like the tipping edge between being a millennial and a Zoomer, and some of us are actual, like, probably we could say more like solidly Zoomers. This was kind of coming out of a time where we were kind of sitting here being like, I don't know, really just like unimpressed with, like, as you said, in some ways unimpressed with just like the millions of kind of just like communist journals out there, or like, social democratic journals, we could say.
There's a lot more. There's a lot of things, even some things that claim to be communist, that are really just social democratic journals.
Oh yeah, like, and a big thing with us is like we see fucking shit. Like, I'm going to be honest, I really am not a big fan of Jacobin for 80, 85, 90% of the stuff that they publish. I think is pretty kind of terrible.
I pretty much read when they publish an Enzo Traverso article and like who I do love, and then a couple other people, and I'm okay with off read, and then the rest of the time, like, I will call it either Gerontian, or if they really piss me off, I'll call it Orleanist Magazine, which is
yeah, like it was us, a lot of us kind of in this moment, all of us who had been kind of like, thinking together, friends, like mutuals, basically, kind of theorizing online and talking to each other. Like, really we're kind of in a moment where like there's all these people just fucking like yip yapping away and just like, talking this shit. Gen Z is in its own weird kind of position where people are under this impression that it's like, as like I think some older generations do, like inherently revolutionary in some way, or like Gen Z is particularly woke.
I heard that like about millennials too.
Yeah, you see, it's like the same kind of shit where like we're just trying to be like, no, what we really wanted was to build a place where we're like, okay, people who don't need fucking connections to get published in Jacobin, young people who are trying to work through stuff like high theory or new theory, stuff that is like unique and like speaks to kind of their experiences, their understandings of history and so on. We wanted to have a place where people can have the opportunity to publish that stuff and have like discussions and things around it, right? Like there is a place for us to be kind of thinking through some of these theoretical questions and still applying them to like actual, questions of organization, questions of thinking through history and lessons for the future, right? It really kind of is like almost like its own sort of like in my interpretation anyway, sort of like a class consciousness project. We are kind of like sharpening kind of the knife of like what a kind of like, new sort of like thinking, or new sort of like, I don't want to make it like a purely like reified generational thing, but kind of a way to sort of like refresh, some of the discussions that we're having about like, communist theory, or just like, any of the kind of like organizing. We don't have to have like any super strict divides of like, orthodoxy, so long as it contributes to this goal of like understanding the times that we're in and how best to move forward from it. That is what we're happy to publish. As far as the stuff that we have published so far, the people that we've interviewed, and just sort of the questions that we've asked, I think we've done our best and have done a really great job so far. And I'll toot my own horn a little bit of sticking to that and kind of working through that. So yeah.
What I'm going to say as a zennial, Gen X millennial who's ancient, is I actually found, what I found interesting is that you're returning to questions that I feel like got dropped between Occupy and the rise and seemingly subsequent fall. It may be too early to tell, but it seems pretty folly lately of the DSA left. I've been watching the DSA reports and be like, we may or may not have lost another 20,000 members. I'm like, well, you only had 100,000 to begin with, and you're losing more members than most communist organizations have ever had. But you also had them, so But I think objectively we have to be honest and say, like, well, that social democratic bore from within the Democratic Party strategy didn't bear any fruit. Like, and given every indicator is that the Democrats are going to lose, and maybe losing so bad that they'll be out of power for generations, like Labour in Britain. We might need to reconceive some things.
Yes.
And it's good to watch people reconceive it. And I feel like it reminds me of, like I said, as a Xennial, the way some of the younger of us felt who came out of, like, when I was on the left, and this is how bad things were, you were either in this horizontalist, alter-imperialist stuff, and not all that stuff is not bad. I don't want to make it sound like it was.
Totally.
Or you were a weird Trotskyist or Maoist 68er who is the last person from your sect in a group, and you were like 75. And you would like lecture me about the one day you met Max Shackman or some shit. And I say that because that's actually happened. And then there was nobody else. Like, and that all changed, and that's great. I think totally. You know, the Bernie moment changed that. I you know, forever criticisms I've had of the Bernie moment, and I have a lot. I do have to say that was a big change.
Totally.
But I feel like now we're about to be back. Well, that didn't work, and what are we gonna do? Because things are serious. Things I don't know, feel a little bit dire in a way that they didn't even in 2008, 2009. Where they also felt a little bit dire in a way that they hadn't the entire 90s and most of the aughts, despite the war on terror. So, so I say that, you know, that I like the spirit of what you guys are doing. And I like this idea of going back and looking at some of this highfalutin graduate school trauma communist theory that some of it's, you know, some of it's arcanely written, admittedly, some of it's a pain in the ass to go through. I do tell people, like, even if you like Baudrillard or even Jameson, don't fucking write like them. Like, don't write like them.
Yeah, please don't. Good God. Like, as much as you want to, don't emulate your heroes in that way, man. Use their findings and do that well, but don't never. Good God.
We don't need to return to no one under Alain Badiou, a person whose theory actually, when I understand it, asterisks, don't hate. But I'm like, why the fuck do you write that way? Like, you hang out with Zizek. Why don't you learn something from Zizek about, like, I don't know, hiding a point in a joke?
Some degree of accessibility that's going to help. Like, even after all the arcane shit, he'll have at least like one thing that'll help you be like, oh, I actually sort of get this now, you know? Which is like, that is the one thing I'll give Zizek, and, you know, back when he was good at what he did. Well, I have my own thoughts about where he kind of sits and you know, his quote unquote usefulness is. But
I think as a person who was coming out of literary academia and educational theory academia kind of separately, I do have some background in anthropology too. I am also from the blue collar working class. I know I feel weird playing the whole, like, I'm authentically a worker because I have, like, I'm a teacher and I have 2 graduate degrees. So even though my parents were blue collar and it was my habitus, that's not who the fuck I am. Like, let's be honest. But I did find Zizek in like 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008 to be a motherfucking breath of fresh air. When I, you know, despite all the weird Lacan shit, despite the strange jokes, despite his politics are actually quite opaque.
Opaque in some ways, and then really fucking like explicit in some areas. Like, I still his shit with like queer and trans people just drives me fucking nuts. And that's like one thing like I think is just fucking irredeemable about him, is he just will not budge on just like his pretty fucking backwards, just like And like dogmatic, even not even just him being ignorant, but him just like wanting to stick to guns that like literally nobody in his like not very few people I think want to stick to, who are kind of like in and around his
weird. Like we got to hang on to the categories of Freud and Lacan from the 50s, like for some reason that I don't quite understand.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, at least Nina Powers writing weird stuff
Jesus.
in Compact Magazine, but
everybody's fucking favorite new leftist journal. What a fucking
new leftist journal that has more staff members who are
like hardcore fucking conservatives. Yeah,
literal Catholic nationalists.
Yeah, it's that's so cool. I love this is where we're at now, you know.
Yeah. But oh my god, that shit's wild.
Yeah.
The fact that the Spike people came back, that group never be like, how does a left group that take Koch brothers money not go away? There's a whole lot of stuff that, but you know what it is actually. As a side note, I see this kind of shit every time a leftist were in opposition mode, they switch into trying to do something with the Democratic Party and they get burnt. Because I saw this also in like 2009, 2010. Where like you had people making weird forays like, we're going to sit with Paul Craig Roberts, paleo conservative, and we're going to together fight the empire. And I'm like, I feel like, like I've had Scott Horton, a rabid libertarian right winger, on my show, but only to talk about foreign policy issues. Like, I don't think we could sit down and be like, well, let's form an alliance against the sinner.
Yeah, no, it's not fucking happening, man.
It's just like, I'm like, yeah, that doesn't work. And when the last time that happened, a bunch of petite bourgeois and lumpen people in Europe built a base for a party of conservative reactionaries to then take, and I'm talking about the Italian Fascist Party here, but it's true, then take a whole bunch of disaffected ultra leftists or culturally conservative leftists, both into the core of the fascist intellectual project. Now, that wasn't the base of the fascists. The base of the fascists was different than the base. But, but the leadership was socialist synthesis and defectors.
Right.
And that's, whenever I see us like, well, let's take a bunch of tech reactionary money and try to use it against them, I'm like, we're in a bad spot. And we've been here. It's a temptation that happens when the popular front strategy with the Democrats ends up with us getting screwed. And I did remember like reading Bhaskar Sankara talking about like a popular front this time run by not Stalinist but democratic socialist, and I'm like, I somehow feel like that you didn't read history very well about how this played out in the 1930s in the United States, or how it's played out ever. So, but I also get what people say, because if you want to do the party building and your conception of party, and another problem, to get back to your article, and your Purposely magazine, sure. Another problem that comes with this party stuff is like, what people meant by party in 19th century, early 20th century Europe is not what people mean by party in the United States or Western Europe now. Not at all. Like, so when they're like, oh, well, we need a party, let's try the People's Party. Or I'm like, well, we tried it with the Green Party. And as a voter signification party that's not cadre driven and this, that, and the other, you're shut out from the ballot. And that's how we ended up with this weird DSA form in the first place. So we're just gonna do it again the same way, but call it a different party because we can just do that somehow. I mean, that was my frustration with the People's Party stuff. I'm like, but didn't we try this with the Green Party in the 70s with Peter Cornejo? And then look at where that went. Like, it went to Nader running 5 times and losing. And like, Actually, that's what this Bernie thing reminded me of. It felt like the same amount of steam when I was listening to people in the 90s when I was in high school talk about the Green Party and be like, we need to run Nader again. I'm like, so the Democrats can use us as a scapegoat for all their problems.
Yeah, right. There'll be some kind of like, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's yeah, I don't understand the Bernie shit. Like I especially now after how crushing that loss was, and after again the same kind of fucking scapegoating that was happening to him through like the Democratic Party too, right? Like I just don't see in any capacity. Also, listen, God bless the man. I'm sure he's a wonderful guy, or possibly just like a nice person. But he's also like he's very old, and like I just.
I've been refraining from making Weekend at Bernie's jokes since
2019.
You
know,
like,
I know it's just one of those things where just like logistically, it also to me doesn't really make sense, and in some weird symbolic way, I guess too, it also just sort of speaks to the state of that kind of strategy too, that we just keep throwing this poor old man over and over again at the same fucking problem, and hoping it's gonna stick.
Let's recapture that lightning in the bottle the first time, and the comparisons are often made to Reagan, but I'm like, Reagan was built off of a movement that wasn't began by Reagan. It was began by Goldwater. He was a successor. There was three attempts, and he was pretty old, but in his 60s, not his 80s.
Yeah.
And there was a concerted local area mass movement. And actually what I found fascinating is like, you want to talk about the right always learning from the left more than we do from them.
Yeah.
The Birchers first took vanguard Lenin model stuff to fight communism, and then they actually took Saul Alka-Lindsey's Rules for Radicals and used that to build the conservative strategy to build in communities through churches in the late 60s and the 70s to turn issues that had not been hot button issues even for evangelicals into hot button issues for evangelicals. So like opposing the Civil Rights Amendment and
right,
like they did all that. We have not done that. Like no. we aren't doing like, we're not like going to school boards, running against reactionaries and like fighting them in the street, which is like what you would think we would be doing if we were like, maybe not fighting them in the street, but like
yeah.
But but it was what you think we'd be doing if we were serious about like an electoral strategy, actually, because they are building they are going to cities and taking them over, even in blue states. Like, and so like I'm just like, so you want to do an electoral strategy, but you only really want to focus on the guy at the top, and you never want to cost the Democrats a loss because you're too afraid of the Republicans. But the Republicans are okay with actually having some Republicans go down in flames and maybe even being the opposition party are being down for a little while, while they hedge their bets. And like, so it's just like, even as an electoral strategy, to me, it doesn't make sense, you know? Yeah. But the other thing that I think, and I get from articles like what you wrote, is that function of, we're going to build the party, but it's really, you know, we're going to do all these things, but we're really also just going to really do electoral engineering kind of. To me, that just doesn't work. Like, it's clear that it doesn't work. And the other thing that's clear is that the other form of like abstentionists, whether it be ultra left or left or Marxist Leninist or Trotskyist, whatever, all these have had abstentionist periods.
Yes.
Hardcore abstentionism also doesn't work. It breeds weird sectarian things that actually are prone to abuse, are prone to infiltration. I mean, I think at one point that like the RCP was probably half Feds. The Panthers was probably like a third Feds. I mean, like, it's like, we know that these forms have problems. Yeah. And yet, and there's people who study them, like Nunes and other people who've done systems theory and all that, have studied them even like mathematically and can tell you that they have problems. Yes. And that they will always have these problems. Like they mathematically aren't going to work out that many other ways. Yeah. And yet we're just like but like this one time, we won. My favorite thing, I guess I'm ranting probably more than you are, but my favorite thing is when people like talk about the Bolsheviks and their like their replicable conditions, and I'm like, so we're going to have an imperial war, which we all don't die in, by the way, because of nuclear bombs, but like not even in a periphery country where we also have to be lucky and both sides lose.
Yeah.
And survive all the internal competition and also not eat ourselves up and eat our cadre memberships up. How on earth do you think we can apply that model one-to-one to the imperial core nations today? Or even, I mean, frankly, even the non-core nations today, because the kinds of population bases, the kinds of military and political structures, none of them look like Tsarist Russia in 1913.
Totally, right. Yeah, no, they don't. And like, I mean, I guess like, some of the Marxist-Leninists that I know would probably be like, well, obviously we can't just like map it one-to-one. We still have to pay attention to like the conjuncture and like the particular conditions. And that's the whole point of that. They'd go off about fucking dialectical materialism or something. And, like, oh, fucking Lenin or like Stalin said this or whatever.
Immortal science and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Stalin, although depending on what kind of Marxist-Leninists they are, their Stalin quotes will be highly selective to a particular period without acknowledging that Stalin's positions on, say, economics changed rapidly between like the 1930s and 1951.
Right.
There's a whole lot of that where I'm just like, and I have to also admit, like, I get amongst young alienated Zoomers who don't have the trauma of the Cold War and do see like anti-imperial movements and movements of color that were more sympathetic to Marxist-Leninism for reasons that make perfect fucking sense. Actually,
100%. Yeah.
Why that might be appealing, but I'm like, I don't know many people outside of very specific circumstances of any race to whom you're going to have a strong appeal on Stalin.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is just like, that's not going to get like, and listen, even people who like aren't just like, we're not, when I say that I'm like eye rolling at Stalin and shit, it's not because I think he's like single-handedly destroyed the USSR. So I'm not that stupid to kind of like think in those terms, but I just don't think Stalin was a very good, like if you're turning to Stalin for theory, I just don't think he was a very good theoretician. And I would hope that if you're trying to
win the debate, so we got rid of the people debating him.
Yeah, but, like I think that's fair, right? So it's just one of those things where I just like I can, there still is kind of this insistence that they're like coming back to kind of the point. They, even though they might be aware that you can't, map one-to-one a particular kind of party form, from like the same conjunctural conditions from like 1917 or so or whatever, leading up to and after, the Bolshevik Revolution. They still are just like, no, but the Bolshevik Party, this is the only way that we're going to be able to do it, baby. This is the only way that we can organize. And it just like, it leads, I think, it leads to a lot of just like, it can lead to a lot of, in my personal experience, a lot of really annoying purity politics about like how we take on certain actions, what we need to do. And you will still forget at the level of like the local conjuncture, dude, literally who cares about this besides us? Like why are we having these these fights or these discussions that don't go anywhere? And we have not done anything to materially build towards like what we would call communism yet. Do you know what I mean? Hence why I just like, it's helpful to be like, all right, let's change the fucking grounds of how realistic we're being with this debate here and what our expectations are. And for God's sakes, like, let's be a little bit more flexible here. Obviously you don't want to be fucking co-opted. Literally no one does, but like that risk is going to come no matter what you do. And so you're inevitably already hopefully addressing those questions, and no matter what kind of organizing that you're taking on and what form that takes, and who you're interacting with.
I think we have to look at like both the CPUSA in the United States in the 50s and the Communist Party of France and Communist Party of Italy in the 60s and 70s, where it's like you guys literally didn't take a line that was very much like like that was that different from, I don't know what just the Democrats were saying at the time. And in ways that often didn't make sense. Like for example, the Communist Party USA did tons of wonders for building up Black cultural institutions.
Yes.
Like I think there's not like a single Black writer I can think of that's important that was not at some point paid by the Communist Party, be it Richard Wright, be it James Baldwin, be it what's her name who wrote A Raisin in the Sun. At the same token, almost none of them stayed in the Communist Party.
Yeah.
From Harry Crews to Richard Wright to James Baldwin. One of the contradictions that you can get around was that they were having them organize in a party, even in the LBJ era, where, so you might have Communist Party members getting an audience with Robert Kennedy. Actually, true fact. Lorraine Hansberry is actually who I'm thinking. She actually did have an audience while she was in the CPS USA. She had an audience with Robert Kennedy. At the same token, they were objectively in a party that was in league with a majority segregationist faction of the United States. And that was not resolvable. And then in the case of like France, like the kinds of contortions the COF had to turn itself around to do to like deal with Algeria, to deal with its relationship to the Socialist Party, to deal with like never challenging the Socialist Party or even really de Gaulle, like it was too much for a lot of people to take. And the milieu that we talked about in the beginning comes out of that. And I think like, if people want to say, well, you know, the mortal science of Marxist-Leninists led the way, I'm like, but how do you explain these Marxist-Leninist parties who objectively actually took positions identical to like stuff that you're going to complain about in the DSA?
Totally,
And the fact that they did that led to this splintering into the 1,000 sect period, both Trotskyist and Maoist in the 60s and 70s. So, like, I feel like I often feel like, well, they don't know their theory and they don't really know their history. Like, they know, like, they've read some books on 1917, and like and maybe some books on like the 30s, and a lot of them throw Grover Furr at me. Which is a whole different problem. And then when I complain about like, have you read even Soviet positive revisionists like Arthur Geddes or Sheila Fitzpatrick or Fitzgerald, people who like have revised the numbers down for the purge and do not see that the Soviet Union is like a net negative force in history,
right,
and yet they would still laugh at like at Sean Guillory, for example. I've literally talked to him about this on Sean's Russia blog. It's like, you know, he's a Soviet friendly Russian historian, and he's just like, when we talk about Global Fur, we just kind of snicker. Like, I'm like, yeah, he's a literature professor at Montclair College, which, I mean, he is a professor, but not in the subject area that you guys take him seriously in. And admittedly, like, there's good work by people who aren't either. Lars Lee, for example, who I have mixed feelings about, but he's writing out of his discipline. Every David Harvey book ever written is written out of his discipline.
100%. The dude literally never does geography except for like one book, you know.
Right?
So
like, it's like, I laugh about this. Like all these boomer communists who got tenure so they could finally write whatever, like
whatever they wanted to.
But that's a whole nother thing. I think what I find interesting, I guess we've been talking about this and we've been going around in circles, but my listeners are used to me doing this, so don't worry about it. It's not you.
There you go.
What I think interesting about this project is what I like about Negation is you're taking the new, but you are actually putting it in dialogue with the corpus of communist theory, both in the historical communist parties and in like the theoretical academic sphere that a lot of us were tortured by, and trying to make it of use. And that's vital because I think we, like I said, I think we're about to get our asses kicked.
Yeah.
Well, I would like to say we're not about to get our asses kicked because I wasn't really part of that whole like go into the Democratic Party thing, but my friends were, so I can't say that I am without sin.
Right.
None of us can. I think we're going to have to look at that. And we're going to have to take a hard look at that because I also think, as we've been implying earlier, there's been a lot of move rightward, and there's been a lot of capture.
Yes.
Both elite capture and right-wing capture of people who have been on our side. There's obvious flips like Michael Rettenwall, if you know that guy. If you don't, good for you.
Yeah, I'm unfamiliar. So
he was a kind of ultra left communist who had a kind of breakdown, I think around 2017, and like went on Bill O'Reilly and Tucker Carlson and like became a right wing, kind of a far right wing pundit.
That's fucking great. I love it.
Yeah. So there's the obvious ones, and then there's subtle things like people who are like, well, we're just gonna take right wing money and like hang out with a bunch of Catholic monarchists.
Yeah.
And you know, and like, I mean, when I was like, how is Adrian Vermeule and Chris Caldwell and a bunch of Marxists on a panel together? I mean, and unfortunately, it's even gotten some people who I kind of respect, like Vivek Chivers. Like,
oh yeah, that's it's fucked.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you the last question.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you see Negation as kind of an extension of the project of, say, Viewpoint Magazine, which I think you interviewed?
Yeah, we interviewed Assad Haider on there. Yeah. Yeah, an extension. I mean, I think a lot of us who came together and started Negation are very inspired by a lot of the work and have read heavily a lot of the work that Viewpoint does. Like, we definitely will like cite them as definitely like an inspiration for some of the stuff that we do, kind of the theoretical interests that we have and the questions that we're trying to address. I don't know if we see ourselves as like a direct continuation, but we're definitely, like I would say, like strongly, I think, influenced. You can maybe kind of draw a definitely like as a genealogical line, I would say, to some degree, between Viewpoint and quite a few of the people who do stuff at Negation and written for us. Yeah, I mean, I think we still try to think of ourselves as like relatively distinct, but still trying to keep in dialogue with what we kind of just think are the most kind of, you know, are useful developments that aren't being talked about, you know, things that are like again, we tried to put a really big emphasis in our last kind of solicitation articles on stuff that, you know, maybe isn't, you know, focused on. Like, we are interviewing people who are in like movements like the Student Christian Movement of the Philippines, this sort of kind of like liberation theology inspired movement in the Philippines, and kind of talking about the situation there and like Duterte's, you know, brutal war against like leftist and communist organizations and folks there.
As a side note, do you maybe I don't know how, if you were young enough to or too young to remember this, but there was a section of communists, and they have retracted, but even in like Telesur, who thought that Duterte was going to be some kind of anti-imperial leftist.
Really?
Yeah, for real.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I was like, because he was like doing stuff like pivoting towards China and
right.
And they ate their words pretty quickly, admittedly. But I think if you like read some stuff, I think from around 2015, 2016, you're like, they thought what?
Yeah.
Like, it seems so absurd now.
Right. Yeah.
Similarly, I think some people had some real weird ideas about Erdogan.
Yeah, I remember that too. Yeah.
And I was like, y'all are projecting. So yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it's good that people are putting these other movements that I think are often misunderstood. And frankly, like I haven't like, so when the DSA realized it couldn't do anything really in its domestic politics, it started like finally discovering internationalism again. But then, like, when I read what they have to say on, like, Pedro Castillo or the stuff that's going down in Chile or AMLO, I lived in Mexico for many years, and I'm like, I'm like, y'all are real naive. Like, the AMLO's doing some interesting stuff on, like, renationalizing the denationalized, like, energy infrastructure, but he's also still doing U.S. bidding on, like, border movements, and he's had some weird alliances with people on the PAN, which is, for people who don't know, the Party Action International, which was the opposition to the PRI that kind of was allowed to take power for 2 rounds with Vicente Fox and Calderon. And he's been, you know, like, we're going to remove all the neoliberalism references from the textbook, but we're also going to make appeals to. So AMLO's a weird figure.
Yeah.
Pedro Castillo is a very strange figure.
Yeah.
An indigenous figure, an interesting figure, but he has issues with his own party because his own party has Marxist-Leninist roots, but he's not actually from it. He's from the outside teachers movement. And I've just seen people cover this uncritically. Are like, frankly, people just believe the Workers' Party stuff about like Lula and stuff from Brazil, and I'm like, did you guys not, like, do you guys think that, like, Bolsonaro came out of nowhere and, like, Dilma Rousseff didn't really screw up, like, you know, and stuff like that. And I bring that up because I think you do have to understand these movements. Like, what are the divisions in Mexico? I'm like, okay, so you have the Zapatistas, you have the Workers' Party people, you have AMLO's sort of left, like, electoral left opposition. AMLO comes out of a faction. AMLO's family is literally, like, kind of center left royalty from the revolution. Do you know the factions of the revolutions? Do you know what happened? It's just like, why are you commenting on a culture whose movements and history you don't really know? And frankly, any North American Marxist who is serious needs to know what's going on in the Caribbean, in Haiti, in Mexico, and in Canada, more than they need to know what's going on in Europe, more than they need to know what's going on in South America, because those are the people whose immediate trade infrastructure is meshed with ours.
Totally.
Like, and I'm just like, I get really frustrated when I'm like, so, but my thing is, like, I like it when people do that, but I like these micro kind of niche, not micro niche, but I would say, like, movement ethnographies and stuff, so that we can see what people are actually doing and how it is at the kind of granular level. I sometimes wish more people would put it together on the, like, somebody would do both. But I really get tired of, like, well, let's do another critical support for Maduro or something. I'm just like, come on. Like, like, I'm not against Maduro or anything, if U.S. imperialism really fucked with him, but like you illustrate that you don't really understand the situation at hand, or the fight. Like my thing is, like, Maduro's had to neoliberalize a lot of Chavez's stuff, and, like, no one's talked about it, like, at all. So it's I wish people would study it, and not just study it from its historical way. I think there's a lot to learn about, like, Chavismo and, like, their attempts to, like, sync up with councils. Like, actually, they do some of the stuff that, like, Nunes is talking about.
Totally,
But they got in a bind because of their dependence on one commodity as their primary means of funding their projects, you know? And that makes you really vulnerable to either Saudi Arabia or the United States fucking with you. Like,
they can kind of twist your arm, man. They have the thing they can grab. I was going to mention, like, I think you kind of bringing up the sort of need to sort of, like, be understanding the history, or, like, if we're going to be looking at this stuff, it's interesting because when we interviewed, I guess this is a year ago now, Austin Gonzalez, who I guess now is a member of the DSA's NPC, and at the time there was some stuff in between where he left, and there was, I'm sure you probably heard about some of the stuff that was going on at the NPC, but he's back there now. But he had been part of like a DSA caucus. He'd been part of like the DSA International Committee's like election observer delegation to go to Peru and look like before the Castillo election, right? So when we were interviewing him, a lot of it was us also trying to like bring up, a lot of sort of those factions, the histories, here are these things that are going on. How are we using this to understand what's going on? How we ask somebody who was there on the ground, who knows the history pretty well, and was interacting with the locals, like in the midst of this election, like how can we put this all together, right? Like, I think when we have like, engaged with stuff with the DSA, and I've tried to like think through that, like, I think it's still like, it's interesting. There'll be like parts and areas in the DSA where like, even if there's like some overall issues that I still have, they still somehow manage to do some like kind of incredible stuff. Like, and I think the NPC at times when they're able to go and do stuff like that is important, the work that needs to be done. So, having a chance to still engage with that, and then also still engage with it critically, like push those kind of harder questions and think about, bringing in that extra context, right? So it's not just simply like, it's like the same thing. I was talking to Dave Bell, who wrote for us. He wrote a really great article on like Bobby Sands, the big like a martyr basically for like the IRA and stuff, and things, died in the hunger strikes during the Troubles in the H blocks. And so Devell wrote kind of an article about kind of the writing of Bobby Sands in connection with like decolonial theory. And we had him on our podcast. I was talking to him, and we like asked him like, hey, so we hear all this shit about like Sinn Féin winning in like Northern Ireland. Like, does this mean anything? And it was like really good for him to also just be like, hey, it probably doesn't mean shit. Actually, let's be real. Or if anything's going to happen, it's going to take years. Here's all this kind of like historical context, factual understanding. Like, we can't get super excited.
Run because their enemies lost, not because they gained more seats too. Like,
right. And like, it's also Sinn Féin. They're fucking like, they're a conservative. Like, as far as like a Republican movement goes, like Irish Republicanism movement goes. Pardon me. They're pretty conservative about that whole thing and are going to take anything slow. They've actively fucked over members of the IRA, right? And kind of left them to get screwed by the British government. So it's helpful to also be able to be like, hey, I know it's really funny for like, American leftists or whatever online to be like, viva the IRA is based. They fucking blew up people or whatever. It's helpful to kind of also, when we do those discussions and stuff, get that context. See, otherwise we're kind of just being...
It's weird living old enough to have the IRA being cool when I was in high school and the IRA being cool again when I'm in my 40s. But
it's all circles. It's all coming back,
It's like, and that's a I have a deep-seated hatred of the English.
Understandable. Respect, as we all should.
It's the one my one anti-internationalist trait is I'm like, well, fuck the English. I guess they're people. It's funny because I work a lot with Jean Baudrillard, who's a Kurd, but he lives in England, and I'm like, well, what do you do? Like, why are you at that cursed island? I do find it interesting. One of the things I think, though, I just made my last point, other than the Sinn Féin stuff, for the longest time, European, particularly British, parties were, and to some lesser degree because of the weird fetish that people have for like Denmark, Sweden, and Norway without really looking at all their policies, and like let me be said when I say this, I would still probably rather live in any of those countries as far as like socialized medicine or just something. I wouldn't want to be an immigrant in Denmark, but nonetheless, and I wouldn't want to deal with the cost of living in some of those places either. But one thing I will say is that one of the things that I have noticed in the last 5 years is the dominance of us looking towards the British left and to a lesser degree the French left as where we in America draw our inspiration from. Because I've always been like, well, even if they were winning, which they aren't.
Fuck
I mean, what is it, like the third cycle in a row? So I'm like, oh, we're gonna have a centrist, right wing liberal versus Le Pen again.
yeah, exactly.
And Le Pen gets closer and closer every time. Or like, I guess you guys are gonna try to convince me that Mommy Merkel, who is a right winger, is somehow progressive liberal. Or you know, I guess the time where I kind of semi understood it, but still thought they were being naive, was on Corbynism. But where I'm like, even before that though, even before like, okay, the Corbynist Labor Party, it was like America draws its inspiration from like British Trotskyist and like French Maoist, and that's was our model. And the only I think until like the horizontalism of the late 80s and 90s, I do think, and as much as I like some of the European communist theory, some of the that you guys are working with, I do think it's actually good that we are no longer as wedded to British Trotskyism and French Maoism and a bunch of professors who, you know, who took sides in 1968 as student activists, and who were rock stars in the subarm period in the 70s, ignoring how many of like, say, like French Maoists became just outright reactionary liberals in the 90s and whatever. I think it's good that we are finally collectively in the United States moving away from that and actually becoming less Eurocentric, actually looking at Latin America, actually looking at Southeast Asia. I don't always love with the lessons we draw from Southeast Asia, but at least we're looking. And I think even something like Sinn Féin, which is Sinn Féin as an organization, it's like it's a social democratic party now. And its socialist orientation has been diluted quite a bit over time.
Extremely.
It is interesting that Brexit has fucked up Britain so badly that like the Left Party in Scotland is now the Scottish National Party. It looks like the Welsh National Party might actually emerge, and the Unionists are finally just losing so bad in Northern Ireland that like Sinn Féin may just be the last person standing. And it's interesting where we're at, but at that same time, it means we've moved away from just over focusing on the fucking British and the French. Like, I still think we haven't done enough to like really understand Mexico, because we're wedded by NAFTA.
Exactly right. So
like we should be organizing cross-border, and there has been some cross-border organizing actually, but we should be organizing cross-borders as best as we legally can.
Right.
Maybe not even totally legally, and stuff like that. I have liked. I was actually reading your interview on Peru, and I'm going to link all this, by the way. I actually thought Austin Gonzalez, because I tend to mock NPC members, was much smarter on this than, say, the International Committee really was.
He was.
I will give Austin that, and I think that I was like, oh, he actually really has looked at the contradictions here. I have a friend, Camilo Gomez, who lives in Peru, and I was partnered with a Peruvian woman for a long time, so like I know a lot about the history. Like, the woman I was with, and I don't want to drop her name, but like she was descended from somebody in Shining Path, and was always like, I do not understand these weird American leftists who fetishize Shining Path. Like they don't seem to understand what happened and how badly that ultimately went. And so I had context for that. One thing I do get frustrated with, though, is like because of our orientation and our lack of knowledge, like somebody be like, well, talk to me about Latin America. And I'm like, I know Peru and I know Mexico and I know a fair amount about Guatemala, but like Latin America is a big fucking place.
Yeah.
Like I can't speak on the Southern Cone. I can't speak on like what's going on in Uruguay. I kind of know what's going on in Colombia, even if I can't always even remember how to spell it. Like, it's but not always. Particularly, like I've been looking at some of the recent stuff, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Some of the electoral developments, but I'm like, I don't know what that means. I don't have a rich enough sense of their local history to totally know what's going on, other than like the national level politics and how right wing it's been since. And I don't like. I've been trying to work out a theory like why are the countries that this is happening in now, Chile, Colombia, and Peru, were the countries that got skipped kind of by the pink wave of 10 years ago. And so like what I personally, even despite having knowledge of the reason, haven't seen people come up with that. And talk about like, well, why is it happening at these particular junctures now? But these other places that did have the pink wave, they seem to be either battling to maintain, like in Bolivia, are kind of lost their socialist character, like in maybe arguably Argentina. Not that Argentina's ever been super left wing, but like you get what you get, like or like someone will bring up Nicaragua, and I'm like, Nicaragua hasn't really done a whole lot in a while.
Right.
So, what do you think we should be doing with that knowledge? As a person who's in a magazine that really does think we should be taking these international issues seriously, and if you're in the imperial core, you should be building up knowledge bases at minimum. And at least coordinated trade actions. I don't know if we are ready to do a whole lot more than that. In these areas, how do you think we should be doing that now? And why do you think it's important? And why?
Yeah, I mean, I just think looking at the base of that stuff, there's a few things. I mean, there's a really great quote from our interview with a gentleman named Bori, who does a lot of really kind of labor work and stuff in South Korea. So we talked about like South Korean labor politics over kind of the neoliberal turn and into like the 90s and the 2000s and what's kind of going on politically in South Korea. And he has kind of a great thing, kind of pulling from Etienne Balibar and sort of kind of like, some of those ideas is that kind of learning about these histories, learning about these movements is to kind of begin, I think in one way, to build solidarity through difference, unity through difference, like understanding, not just kind of like, well, that's like a leftist struggle. We're going to give that kind of, thing you were talking about earlier, the DSA, just critical support to this, leftist Superior project, like actually getting into the specifics and the differences and being able to still build kind of what's the word I'm looking for here? A universalist politics built on differences. It's a bit of a paradox, but like you get a sense where you're still building that solidarity without trying to simply just like, contort or twist, whatever's going on in this country halfway across the world to sort of like be fit to your, whatever understanding that you have as someone who's in the imperial core, right? So I think it's part of it is that it builds up your own ability to like also think about ongoing things and what's going on. How does that inform your own praxis, your own understanding of like also historical events in your own country and how that sort of informs how things are and what kind of praxis you're going to be doing, whether that be kind of small stuff, whether that be sort of the organizations you're pulling on, what communities are there, who you need to be like talking to, who you need to be organizing with, whether that be like, within your own borders, cross border. I just think knowing this stuff, is just like essential for building your own, your own knowledge and commitment, understanding is like it's a kind of ethical thing you need to do as like a communist. If you call yourself somebody a communist, you don't have to be like, some people I know don't want to call themselves communists because they're like, I just haven't done anything for the Communist Project. I'm just somebody who holds those beliefs. That's fine. If you're in that sort of realm, I really do just think like knowing this stuff helps you also just like, I think, understand that bigger picture. You will understand the importance of, you know, conjunctural, the particular in that notion, right? So you're not just kind of stuck. I think sometimes based on, you know, and some of the ways that we get taught things, or if you ever come across Marx or some kind of like theory for the first time, we often kind of do get stuck in the kind of applying the universals and just kind of laying them flat everywhere. Like this is like, you know, a universal development. Not even you don't even have to necessarily have to be like a stagist, giving like a stagist interpretation of like capitalist development, but even just being like, okay, well, here's what the contradict, like, you know, the dynamics are supposed to be. This is definitely how that's going to play out here. It's going to play out the same this way. Like knowing how combined and uneven development is sort of working in all these different places can help you just sort of, you know, have that self-reflection of what's going on.
Yeah.
It's long and rambly. I kind of said the same thing like 6 times. So I apologize for that, but yeah, that's kind of, I think that's kind of why we center on that importance. So we're not just kind of trapped in our own, you know, especially for us in negation, you know, in a lot of ways, kind of sometimes a high theory bubble where you're saying, you know, sometimes maybe getting stuck on those French or British intellectuals, you know, we need to still be able to, if we have that stuff, it's still useful. We need to wet it to something else that's like concrete and outside of that bubble too. Right.
Yeah. That's the thing that you did that reminded me of what Hader was trying to do over at one point. The other thing I will say, you and I don't know each other super well, but I became committed to this international stuff, even though I'm also skeptical of the way it's used in the United States and the DSA, because I spent 10 years. I spent 3.5 years in South Korea, two years in northern Mexico, and 2 years in the Egyptian counter-revolution. And in both cases, the latter 2 cases, they were hot times. So in northern Mexico, that was the status in a little cartel war.
That's right.
And the ascent of the PRI and a bunch of and the teacher strikes in Oaxaca and a whole lot of dead leftist activists, which I think is actually what finally brought the PRI down. And AMLO was finally able to take advantage of that. But the other thing I would say was, when you're talking about like, yeah, it's easy to talk about universal contradictions. I'm like, when I lived in Korea and when I lived in Egypt, and Egypt was where things were really hot because that was the Sisi counter-revolution. And like leftists were getting liquidated. People I knew disappeared.
Jesus.
Like not Westerners. Well, actually, that's not true. There's an Italian communist student who was tortured to death. But but in general, it was Egyptians who were like labor organizers who sometimes worked with the Muslim Brotherhood, or and the Muslim Brotherhood split in a lot of different ways in response to the Morsi imprisoning. And but the other thing I noticed is work life really was different in these places. Like it was still operated by MCM Prime. But like if you thought that the way labor and work is structured in the United States, it's how it's structured even in a place like South Korea, you are fundamentally wrong.
Yeah, like, fuck you are out of your goddamn mind if you think that's the case, you know. So yeah, 100%.
Like I was just like, oh, they have 72-hour work weeks and they have low minimum wages, but they have a strong social safety net, kinda, but not on everything. So you have good socialized medicine, but there's like no pension plan for the old. It's fucking weird. Like that's South Korea. And like when I watch like you know, everyone's talking about all these like South Korean semi-socialist stuff. I'm like, yeah. Also, it makes more sense if you understand South Korean culture, some of the specific things they're talking about. The gigification was actually more advanced there than it is here. Like, but then you go to a place like Egypt, which is like kind of a state capitalist military society with some private development in the energy sector, and you're just like I often like MMT socialists, and I feel like to bad about it because that Egypt did what they were asked to do by like MMTers and float the currency, and they had, well, my apartment got really cheap. To put it like they had mega inflation.
Right.
And they're so hard to try and get foreign exchange that like I literally was taking my pay and converting it into gold so I could sell it when I got back into the United States. Like that's when things like, and to jewelry so I could wear it and sell it.
Yeah,
like
to be able to
And that was wild. It was interesting to see how fucking uneven. I tend to like world systems theory, but I do have a critique of it in that it often doesn't apply the stuff it sees between nations within nations. Because I think you should look at the imperial core like within the U.S. as it's relate like California and New York are kind of the imperial core within the country.
In the United States.
Well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. As a Canadian, I can immediately start picking out the cities that are all the fucking imperial cores of like Canada, right?
Toronto.
Like Vancouver and Toronto and fucking like arguably, if you wanted to be a dick about it, you could say Calgary too, which is where I'm from originally, right? That's I grew up in that city. Alberta, shout out Alberta, everybody's favorite American Canadian province.
But well, I mean, I like to think of it as cold Texas.
Yeah, basically, exactly. So
I lived in the Maritimes very briefly as a kid.
You did, okay,
in Nova Scotia, which I like to think of. Actually, I don't know if there's an equivalent to the Maritimes. Think poor working class, but still not as reactionary and into extractive industry as, say, Alberta, but only because they kind of got rid of their fish stocks, so they don't have anything to extract.
Yeah, and tons of people in the Maritimes will go and participate in extractive industry in the oil sands in Alberta. Yeah.
Well, because what else are you gonna fucking do?
Unfortunately,
if you don't get a tech job and Halifax or don't move to one of the imperial core cities, like
what's up, man? What are you doing?
A whole lot of options. I guess you can hang out in Newfoundland and speak a cool dialect, but like
hell yeah, hang out in St. John's, dude. This beautiful city in Canada. There you go.
It is. Now that I know you're Canadian, I will talk about the my mission to finish the War of 1812. I do think this is important for internationalism, that we often don't. I think Americans we finally follow, like, one of the things that has changed in the last 20 years is like Americans now know a little bit about Canadian politics, like because of Harper and Trudeau.
Yes, and Trudeau.
Like when the 80s and 90s, we knew nothing. We were like Canada's our hat.
Pretty much, and
I think it's also because Canada's integration into our economic system after NAFTA and its energy policy, its highly extractive energy policy, has meant that we have to follow Canadian politics a lot more. Also, you speak English, and you arguably, I mean, when I was in Korea, no one could tell us apart. Like, Canadians are like, we're nothing like Americans, and I'm like, ask them if they can tell which one of us are different.
Yeah. They'll be like, no, probably not.
You're all weird Waikugan, and I'm like, yep. Like, they know when we're not European, but they can't tell me and you apart, bro.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there you go.
Like, we sound alike mostly. We don't spell alike. You have better health care, but that's really the only. I mean, and slightly less guns, although more guns than people realize. Anyway, I mean, actually, I will end on this question. I've said I'm going to end like 5 times, but I've really.
It's all good. It's all good. No worries.
What do you make of where's the Canadian left? Because the NDP clearly has lost its ability to on even a local level offer. Like, it does seem like the Tories are permanently in charge in Britain now, and the Liberal Party in Canada is going to like be there forever.
Yeah.
Like, even though Trudeau's not particularly popular all the time, but
no, fuck no. So,
but there's no opposition that has any kind of power. What do you see as the future for the Canadian left, and how should the American left and Canadian left sort of deal with each other?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty fucking bleak. We've just sat through like a federal election that nobody wanted to do. We sat through a provincial election in the I live in Ontario now. We just went through a provincial election that also nobody wanted to do. Nothing changed basically in either of those elections except like the left lost seats, like 1 or 2 seats. They just fucked themselves basically. I don't know what the future of this. It's from what I can tell, it's fucking bleak, at least in terms of like electoral politics, in terms of trying to appeal to like, sort of NDP politics. I don't know. Like, it's interesting to watch because the conservatives are doing a shitload of just like infighting. There's a lot of just like splintering or like infighting in terms of like who's helming a lot of even provincial and kind of the federal conservative parties. So like I think that's one of the only things that's keeping kind of Trudeau, sitting where he is. He's like barely holding some shit together. Doing the bare fucking minimum, failing in a lot of areas, but people are just like, he seems to be the best option. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of growing demand for Canadians on the left to be trying to find alternatives, whether that be like our Marxist-Leninist Party, the Communist Party of Canada. Frankly, there's not a ton of, in terms of like communist parties, there's very few options to go around. There's that. There's like it's the Marxist-Leninist Party of Canada, which is like I don't know how to pronounce this guy, Enver Hawks. How do you pronounce it? Hoja. There's like a Hojist party.
Yeah, a weird Hojist party, and you have like you have the IMT. Like
the Maoist party just dissolved like last year, a couple months ago or something. So and there's like tons of
Hojist parties is fucking crazy. But anyway,
it's weird. They pop up every time for an election. They somehow get candidates in like every riding, and then I never hear from them ever again. It's very strange. I don't really know what they're doing other than just running elections. Anyways, but yeah, like there's lots of other smaller kind of like local level organizations that people do. There's a couple there's like an inner NDP like left coalition in the NDP that tries to do stuff, and I think they're unfortunately kind of in the same spot as the DSA where they're kind of diluted. There is actually there's a Democratic Socialists of Canada now, which is basically like trying to emulate the DSA, which I think is a terrible idea. But it's getting a lot of traction.
NDP already did that.
No. That's not them. There's a DSC now. There's a Democratic Socialists of Canada. It's a separate thing, and I straight up don't know what their idea is. Like what they're
are they
like,
part of like the Democratic Socialist? Okay, anyway,
they're like I don't no idea. They might be. They just kind of appeared one day and they started saying they were a radical working class like movement party, and I was like, all right, sure. So I don't know. I think
they're a party though. They're not like an inter-liberal or inter-NDP organization.
They're not attached to any party. No. They just exist.
So so they are like the DSA, except that they're not in a bourgeois party, which is kind of an important distinction. Not that that'd be.
I guess that's fair. Yeah, but they probably would just give us the NDP. I don't know. They're very vague. It's not very clear. Kind of, I think what their goals are, other than just like pushing certain kinds of policy. So I don't have a lot of faith in them, unfortunately, as much as like. But yeah, you see a lot of people turning to the Communist Party. I mean. I see it maybe as like a win in that small way, and that people actually, I think in some way they're slowly being pushed to seeing alternatives on the left, and that might force some of these organizations to maybe revamp themselves because they've been pretty weak for a long time. Maybe there's going to be some kind of new life in what's going on. It's precarious is kind of what I'll say. So, I don't know. Like in terms of just like also like the inter-US Canada question in terms of things on the left, I mean, all I will say is like I think a lot of stuff that's happening on the right wing in both countries is pretty similar with its own little inflections.
Your third most major export to us seems to be reactionaries.
Yeah. There you go. Right. There's
it's from David Fromm to Gavin McGuinness to half of Rebel Media. It's like to Jordan Peterson's. Fuck. Like how many fucking weird Canadian reactionaries can you give us?
We can give you. We'll just keep finding them. We'll just keep shipping them over to you. So I think that's a big thing too, is being able to kind of organize on a lot of. I think there's a lot of overlapping between kind of like what the right's doing in the States and in Canada in that ways, even if they're going to have slightly different inflections, of course. So I think being able to sort of organize around that and how that's working, you can find some maybe solidarity there in terms of like thinking about what's kind of pressing, what these people are talking about. I mean,
are we seeing a? So we have this national conservative movement that actually is kind of a threat, and it's the first time, in the United States where we have something like red Toryism from Britain or progressive conservatism from Canada, which are things that you guys kind of don't have anymore. I mean, Harper Americanized so much.
Yeah, he fucking just like he just bleached all that out pretty much. All the red was gone. Yeah.
Yeah, but is there any resurgence of that up north, because it's a real threat down here?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't see a lot of it. I see a lot of there's a lot of kind of new it's a lot of more libertarian or just very kind of religious right shit that's going on over here than it is kind of any red Toryism. I think red Toryism is kind of just
so we're flipping places.
Yeah, I think if you guys are somehow getting red Tories, like, honestly, good for you. Some ways I kind of would envy that position because, like, Jesus Christ, man, the fucking people
Well, I
that
mean,
you
if
see,
you think
like,
about like who's running Compact Magazine, those weird Catholic,
yeah.
integralist, and like they are putting out basically a red Tory kind of platform. That's why they're reaching out to Marxists to squeeze. The thing is, though, do they really mean it? That's a different question.
Yeah,
almost, of course not. But
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But whereas I have noticed that, like, okay, we don't produce, like, we've been producing libertarians forever, but like lately, we're not making them. They're coming from Canada. And you know, the neocon, a lot of the Lincoln Project people, like right, David Frum was a Canadian man.
Yep.
Like, so I think that's interesting. What I find is interesting is why is there why has there always been so much more coordination between the Canadian and American right than the Canadian and American even center left? Like, now on the national level, of course, there's coordination. Like Trudeau's always been like, whatever American president, we need to trade. We're your number one trade partner. You're one of our number one trade partners. We need your water and energy. You need our market and population. So like, in that sense, they're at a high level, but like, I've never heard let's send a delegation to talk to the NDP and maybe coordinate with that. Doesn't happen. And that's always like interesting to me, particularly when I think about stuff like the auto plant problems, when I'm like, manufacturers are in both countries. Like, in fact, they're split up over Mexico, us, and Canada.
Yeah.
And yet we're not coordinating at all. And that, as a person who, my bio father was a dual citizen, which is
right. Okay.
So like, even though like I am blue collar, I swear I have this weird kind of, I was blue collar when I was a kid.
I get you.
I have this weird kind of multinational, multi-ethnic background. The way in which, like, I would always be like, why don't we know more about each other? And I feel like that's gotten better. Like I said,
I agree.
But it still feels like the American left, like they're like, well, the NDP's cool. And sometimes we have a boner for Trudeau and the Liberal Party, but with that, we've lost the sheen on that now, even down here. I was calling him legacy admission for a long time, but that's just me. But it has been amazing when I thought about, like, in 2008, I was like, why are we not like coordinating this with labor actions and whatnot? I know there's no party or anything to do this, but like, the American Union, I know some of that is because of Taft-Hartley, like our laws make it hard to do, but I'm still like, we have the internet, we have knowledge of each other. We don't have to do it formally. We can just, I don't know, have an off the books conversation. Why aren't we doing that? And that has always struck me, because having lived in 3 of the North American countries, it is, I've always been like, we really do have to operate together to deal with the way capital is integrated in these 3 countries. Like,
yes, huge.
Like, otherwise we're fucked. Like, because they can just jump borders and do. And then the United States can, like, slap both Canada and Mexico around, which it does all the time. Like, like, it's just like
constantly, man.
It's just like, and so, I love fun Canadian conspiracy theory, like my finish the War of 1812 so we can take your water thing. It's just because I know Canadian conspiracy theories and I like to put Canadians on edge. But it's interesting because in another real sense, also climate change means that if we don't deal with this we have to do it as a world unit, but definitely as a North American unit,
yes,
like
huge, yeah,
like we're fucked, like
yeah,
and I noticed, as we talked about, the right actually does operate that way. The right in Canada, partly because it doesn't really there's not a lot of places for it to go in Canada, but
yeah,
the right in Canada does operate coordinating with the right in the United States, like they do.
yeah.
And in fact, when they get frustrated with Canada, they come down here and become a problem for us. So like, it's whereas I can't think of a lot of that, except for like when the sewer socialists fled to Canada in the 30s. Like, there's not a whole lot of history of that coordination, and that, I mean, yeah, I think sometimes I wonder if it's like the weird kind of left liberal nationalism of Canada that's like really trying hard to prove it's not the U.S., like really too hard. Like,
I do think it's a little bit of that. Like, that's the kind of sense that I get, especially in those decades before, like into like the 90s and stuff, where a lot of that, I guess even more into like, I guess the mid 2000s, 2010s, is that more when that myth, I think, began to crumble a little bit of this kind of like pretty, left nationalist, like, peacekeeping, lovely nation that nobody wants, nothing crazy is going on here, right? So like, and if Americans, if we're already so like integrated in some kind of weird way, or kind of just like America's hat, people kind of like, okay, well, we kind of have our own things to deal with. Maybe there isn't a lot to be kind of looking for in Canada at this point. Like, they kind of are just like into a degree, unimportant, kind of this weird extension. We can kind of imagine they're just, similar to us, or some kind of just like, space kind of up there, right? I think part of it though, Canada for a very long time just like really tried to resist any sort of like any sort of idea of like conflation, and like just conflation with the States or with Britain. Like, it was like for decades, especially in cultural production, right? Like, that was like a huge part of like Canadian like cultural policy, or like protecting, you can like Canadian content, like minimum laws, like what kind of Canadian content you need to broadcast, like a certain percentage on radio stations.
Yeah,
and
they're
TV.
still trying to do that actually.
Yeah, they still
with, like,
are.
YouTube.
Yeah,
it's wild.
Yeah,
and I'm like,
it's weird, and like, that fucking YouTube shit's just so dumb. Like, it's archaic and makes no sense. Like, there's no way I think they're gonna get it to work. I don't know. There's a lot of like interesting arguments that I think the argument now, and what I'm more compelled by, is if Canada was trying so hard to prove itself like symbolically to be this different, country or space through like the art or like the culture and some of the other stuff that it did, like the image it put itself out there, it now uses that image or some kind of idea to make kind of like cultural profits. It's more that kind of postmodern turn, right? And I think that's kind of more where Canada's sort of sitting. Like, maybe you can see why that kind of, visage a bit has kind of fallen a little. I'm really glad people are starting to like get on Canada's ass about the fucking mining corporations, because Canada's mining corporations are out just destroying like so much of the fucking world, and people weren't talking about any of that for like decades. So like, it's insane.
I remember when even good liberals were like, what's up with this Canada mining and tar sand shit? And I'm like, maybe you should look at how Canada's industry functions. Maybe honestly, you should also look at how Norway's industry functions. But it's a social democratic gas station. But I think that I do think that's changing. I also think there's this weird, like, American liberals have this weird schizophrenia with Canada. Like, always like, well, we're going to go all run there.
Oh, yeah.
I'd always be like, it's easier to move to Mexico. Like, it costs $100. It costs like $20,000 to get a visa to Canada, motherfucker. Like, you can't afford it. Why don't you go to Mexico? It's really cheap to go to Mexico. There's more Americans there, actually. You go to San Luis Obispo, everyone speaks English. Like, our tourist area like Cancun, right? It's also everybody's.
Yeah.
But like, so, I was like, you guys are weirdly kind of racist. Like, you want to go to like snow white people land and not, well, you have the veneer of multiculturalism, and I will say Canada's better at the veneer of multiculturalism than the United States is. Yeah. But it is a veneer.
It's a huge veneer. Then like, there's so many other reasons as to why, like, multiculturalism was instituted as a policy in Canada, and like, there's a whole whole great analysis. Some people have done tons of like really good stuff on like how fucked up and very empty a lot of that stuff is, especially just like, you know, culture, like
the First People's policies are like, y'all's aren't a whole lot better than ours. Like, it has been in the kind of in the late 20th century, I will say, but in the most of the history of Canada, it's like looked pretty similar to the United States, like residential schools.
100%.
Mass graves.
Yep.
You don't have the Indian Wars, so I guess there's that, which, you know, active genocide. But well, except you kind of do in the Eastern.
Like wiping out, like, you know,
the complete eradication of the indigenous people in Newfoundland. So I don't want to do the comparative atrocity, but like Canada's secretly dark. Because like, I mean, if you're a liberal American, that was a big realization. When I'm like, but like it's the same, like we're not that different. We're like if you read what I love, and then I'll let you go. But I love reading American founding documents that haven't been expurgated when they're talking about like Nova Scotia and Ontario being part of the Union, which there are early documents that are like that. And like no one's like, and like now they like take that out, and I'm like, it's like you're not gonna bring up the War of Northern Expansion. Where we tried to liberate Ontario and then caused the War of 1812 and got our asses kicked. So, which I also admit, from the Canadian perspective, you guys take a little bit too much pride in it.
I agree. We take way too much pride in it. It's
like we defeated the Americans. I'm like, no, Britain defeated the Americans. But like, and we don't talk about it. We're like, War of 1812 happened.
That's it. No, we're not gonna.
It's funny because I took a little bit of Canadian school history, so I like knew about all this shit about the War of 1812 from the Canadian side, and then like I took the American unit in it. I'm like, there was a War of 1812. We won the Battle of New Orleans.
That's
the White House got burnt down. Bye. Like, I'm like, wait, what? The White
why is this fucking footnotes, man? You think should be pretty fucking important that the fucking White House got burnt down? Let's talk about this, man.
And why did it happen again? What were we trying to do?
Exactly, right? So
like it's like that in the Mexican-American War, where you're like, the Alamo, something, Santa Ana, bye.
All I know about the Alamo is I'm supposed to remember it, I guess. You know, we'll stick with that there. That's it.
Yeah. I remember when I was in Mexico City at Chapultepec, and as an American, it's really awkward because you're like walking in, you're like tourist. Oh, this is a shrine to when we traced a bunch of Mexican cadet kids who were 16 off of a cliff because they wouldn't change the flag. Holy shit! No one ever told me this. Like, and then I started researching like how, oddly enough, American racism is why the U.S. didn't take all the way down to Mexico City, because like the racist and the anti-imperialist Catholics made a coalition not to take Oaxaca, Sonora, because they literally, one side was like, well, they're good Catholics and we don't want to do that, and the other side was like, they're brown people and we don't want to do that. So it's true fact.
I believe you.
Like Polk, because that was Polk's goal, was to limit Mexico to basically what would be Querétaro, District Federal, Oaxaca, and Chiapas would have been what Mexico would be. The Yucatan would have stayed New Spain, and then like all of North Mexico would have been absorbed. And then the other interesting thing about Mexican history during the Revolution, what Pancho Villa wanted to do was to liberate Southern California and Texas and found another country, which is the Republic del Norte, which was why they were making raids into the United States. Because they wanted to take part Texas back, part of New Mexico, and maybe Southern California. They weren't going to take all of it, but but also succeed from the Mexican government.
I see. Interesting. Okay.
So yeah, I mean, again, and what I find fascinating is like no one in America knows this history. Like, it's like, and I'm like, that's pretty fucking big. Like, that's why we're as big as we are. Like, you're like, everyone's like, Louisiana Purchase, we bought it from France, something. Alamo took it from Mexico, who also took it, to be fair. But it's like that history is largely unknown. I mean, people know about Manifest Destiny, but they don't really know like
the extent of like the actual like material like violence and shit that went on in the conflicts.
I mean, like that's what I think that is one difference between the. Well, I don't know. Your Yucatan frontier stuff is pretty bloody too. But anyway, now we're talking Canadian shit. In history, have nothing to do with the magazine. Check out Negation Magazine. Check out Andrew's work. Check out those interviews. I'm gonna link your 2 articles and a couple of the interviews that we mentioned. I think what you guys are doing is actually really interesting. I hope that it continues. I hope it has this international focus, and I hope it becomes. I personally think we're going to be in some dark times in all the countries in North America. Maybe Mexico will have slightly less dark times, and Mexico's had enough dark times. But that we need to, we're going to need to really look at this stuff and try to apply it, because we are running out of steam on the stuff we've been trying for the last 15, 20 years.
Totally.
So,
yeah.
All right. Thank you for coming on. Anything you want to plug in addition while you're before I let you go?
At the moment, no. I mean, yeah, just like check out Negation, check out the work that we're doing, check out the Party Form dossier, like some of the stuff that we're writing. We have like a PDF of it, all of those things online. You'll get a kind of a pretty good view of some of the reviews of some of like the questions that we're taking up. Yeah, definitely take an interest in it. And yeah, thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for coming on. It was a great conversation. And I'm gonna do some Patreon business while I let you go.
Okay.
And have a great day. So I have to do the Patreon announcement for the Patreons, because that's something that I do for the Con El Cohanans, which are those of you who support this project at a high donation level. There are a fair number of you right now, but I'm going to go through the most recent and kind of touch on that here. So we have Kenny A, Jill, David, my homeboy YNW from Salt Lake. He's a friend of mine. And then I think recently we've had a couple of even newer people come on. So I'm going to make sure I include them in this so that they get their shout out. David P, who I believe maybe the same David P who recently worked something for Sublation Mag that was quite good. And there you go. Thank you for your support. Remember, we have all kinds of tiers of support here. I will, lowest $3 US. I think like $4 Canadian. It's like $4.50 or something. It's like $3.50 Canadian. And we're a pretty international audience. For that, you get you get the archive of. I got 10 years of back material, peeps. You get access to that. I'm so bad at. I'm gonna stop now. I'm so bad at selling stuff. Communists shouldn't be good at selling stuff anyway. So if you like what we do, we appreciate your support. I use it to support other stuff. I use it to do travel and to pay for my fees. And you have helped me out personally. I'm not going to say that it all goes back into the show, because I was able to visit my family this year off of your support. And I thank you personally for that. So thank you for all that. Check out Negation Magazine stuff. I really do think it's good and interesting, both in the high theory and in those practical interviews. And if you have an allergy to sectarianism, it doesn't have the sectarian problem, guys. Like, you don't have that issue. So go check it out, and give them some time. And you know what? If you really want to help them out, share their stuff. Okay. Share their stuff before you share my stuff. Like, I got enough power. So thank you for all your support, and have a great evening. We're going to end with the chill close. And so you guys are used to the Ursula K. Le Guin quote, and kind of ride out the wave. Have a good evening, and check out the work we mentioned here tonight.